You were in the dimly lit chambers of the Louvre Palace in the late 16th century, where the scent of beeswax candles and damp stone lingers in the air. A winter wind scratches faintly against the leaded glass windows, but inside, the court of France is warm with conversation, hushed, conspiratorial, and endlessly interested in the lives of others. It is here that Margaret of Valois, daughter of King Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, is both the subject and the curator of countless whispered tales. To understand Margaret's later reputation as a collector of lovers, you have to picture her childhood world, raised among books as much as among courtiers. She grew up in a palace library stocked with the classics of Greek and Roman romance, medieval chansons de geste, and the latest Italian love sonnets. Her mother, Catherine, ensured that her daughters were educated to the same standard as her sons, a rare choice for a queen in an age when a woman's political worth was often measured by her marriage prospects alone. Margaret was tall, poised, and striking in a way that Parisian poets would later compare to a living statue. But what most remembered about her was her speech, soft, persuasive, and always laced with literary allusions. In the rigid etiquette of court life, where one misplaced word could ruin a noble's fortune, Margaret knew exactly how to speak in a way that left her listener feeling as though they had been granted a rare confidence. Her early education was overseen not only by governesses and confessors, but also by humanist scholars. She learned Latin well enough to read Ovid without translation. The court chronicler Brantemy later hinted without subtlety that Margaret's love of poetry would lead her into practical exercises in the art of love itself. While such remarks were meant to amuse, they reveal how deeply her identity became tied to the mingling of romance and politics. The Valois court of the 1560s was a place where alliances were sealed as often in bedchambers as in council chambers. Margaret's brothers Francis II, Charles IX, and the future Henry III were notorious for surrounding themselves with young men of charm and questionable discretion. In such a climate, conversations about personal liaisons were not only tolerated, but often used strategically. Margaret learned early that affection and loyalty could be cultivated much like a personal library, carefully selected, preserved, and sometimes lent out for mutual benefit. When she was a young teenager, Margaret began keeping what her ladies-in-waiting jokingly called her livre de cœurs, her book of hearts. This was not an actual book bound in leather, but rather a habit of recording, in her own memory, the details of each flattering courtier who caught her attention. It might be the way a Spanish ambassador adjusted his velvet sleeves before bowing, or the way a young poet recited a verse without glancing at the parchment. These details were catalogued and remembered as carefully as one would remember where to find a rare, illuminated manuscript on a high shelf. It is tempting to see this as nothing more than a young woman's harmless pastime. But in the hothouse, politics of the Valois dynasty, where the French wars of religion were about to erupt, every friendship, flirtation, or private exchange could have implications far beyond the personal. Margaret's Book of Hearts was not just an anthology of attractions, it was a mental record of who might be swayed, who could be trusted, and who could be relied upon in a crisis. Her first notable attachment recorded in the memoirs she would later write in exile was with Henry de Guise. He was tall, bold, and, in the eyes of Parisian society, almost too perfect an example of Catholic chivalry. Margaret was 15 when their mutual admiration was noticed, and Catherine de' Medici quickly intervened. A match between her daughter and the head of the ultra-Catholic League might destabilize the delicate religious balance. she was trying to maintain. And so, like many volumes in her mental library, the Henry de Guise chapter was left unfinished, returned to the shelf but never quite forgotten. The court moved from Paris to the countryside during outbreaks of plague, and Margaret's world expanded beyond the capital. She began to observe the differences in regional manners, the flatter, more restrained compliments of the Loire Valley, the bold, theatrical declarations of Gascony. Each variation was added to her collection of social knowledge. She did not merely receive admiration, she studied it, noting what was useful and what was excessive. Meanwhile, Catherine arranged for Margaret to marry Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince whose union with the Catholic princess was intended as a gesture of reconciliation in a deeply divided kingdom. The wedding, held in Paris in August 1572, was followed within days by the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a night and day of brutal killings targeting the Protestant guests. Margaret's carefully cultivated world of refined conversation and coded affection was abruptly overshadowed by the bloodshed in the streets. She later described, in words both understated and chilling, how she had hidden several Huguenot nobles in her own bedchamber, pleading for their lives. Her role as a political and personal intermediary had never been more dangerous. And yet, even in those hours, she recognized the importance of knowing exactly who would respond to a plea, who could be persuaded to show mercy. From this point on, Margaret's collection of loyal friends, admirers, and allies took on a new weight. It was no longer merely a game of poetry and glances, it was a means of survival. Those she drew close were not just ornaments to her reputation. They were human resources in a kingdom, perpetually on the brink of civil war. As her marriage to Henry of Navarre grew strained, both partners, notoriously independent in their affections, Margaret found herself more often in her own apartments, surrounded by a circle of gentlemen and ladies whose loyalty she tested and measured over time. Some would remain constants for decades. Others, once treasured, would be quietly dismissed when their usefulness or sincerity proved lacking. In later years, she would be accused of keeping too many books open at once, as one Paris wag put it. But, for now, in the late 1570s, she was still refining her library of heart-seeking, not just charm but constancy, not just admiration but utility. The real test, she suspected, would come when politics and personal loyalty collided again. And that question lingered over the candlelit halls of her residence. When that moment came, which of her carefully chosen companions would turn the page with her, and which would quietly close the book? You are no longer in the Louvre's glittering galleries, but in the quieter, more controlled atmosphere of the Hôtel de la Reine Marguerite in Paris. The floors are muffled under Turkish carpets, the air sweetened with orange blossom water, and the soundscape is less the loud jangle of courtly politics and more the rustle of letters being sealed with wax. Margaret of Valois is now in her late 20s, and the Book of Hearts she keeps still unwritten but remembered in sharp detail has matured from a list of charming acquaintances into a catalogue of political relationships with romantic overtones to Henry of Navarre is by now an open performance, a partnership of necessity rather than intimacy. They reside apart for long stretches, he in the Protestant stronghold of Pau or La Rochelle, she in Paris or again. Between them flows a steady river of formal correspondence, thick with diplomacy but thin with personal warmth. Their estrangement gives Margaret a freedom unusual for a queen consort, but also an insecurity. Her influence must be cultivated. Without the full authority of her husband's active support, The gentlemen who orbit her chambers are rarely chosen for physical beauty alone. They are often men of letters, provincial nobles with strong local followings, or courtiers with access to rival factions at court. To an inattentive eye, they might look like nothing more than fashionable companions. To Margaret, they are annotated, volumes each, marked with her quiet observations on their reliability, discretion, and value in the great chess game of French politics. It is in this period that Margaret's relationships begin to take on a more deliberate geographic spread. She fosters ties with Gascon gentlemen who can carry messages into Protestant territories. She maintains the favor of Catholic loyalists in Paris. She keeps a wary but courteous rapport with envoys from Spain and the Papal States. Each chapter in her Library of Hearts serves as a potential bridge or blockade between her and the many powers tugging at the fragile threads of the French monarchy. One of her most enduring entries is the Seigneur des Champs, a man with a ready wit and a disarming smile, who nonetheless carries in his pocket the names of half a dozen Protestant leaders willing to deal privately with her. Margaret values him not for declarations of love, but for his subtlety. He knows when to disappear from a gathering and when to linger by the door to overhear a conversation. Such skills are not traditionally celebrated in love poetry, but in the half-shadowed corridors of late Valois politics. They are worth their weight in gold. By the early 1580s, her position becomes more precarious. Her brother, Henry III, has ascended the throne but rules a court riddled with intrigue. The Catholic League, under Henry de Guise, exerts a growing pull on Paris. Protestant forces under her estranged husband are restless. Margaret finds herself navigating the dangerous role of an intermediary between three rival powers, each of which mistrusts the other, and all of which have reasons to mistrust her. Her Paris residence becomes a salon, not only for poetry and music, but also for coded negotiations. A madrigal sung in her drawing room might carry an embedded reference to a treaty. A gift of embroidered gloves might signal a readiness for talks. Margaret has a gift for transforming potentially dangerous political meetings into seemingly harmless social gatherings in private. She still relishes the intellectual companionship of her lovers, though the word here must be understood in its Renaissance fluidity. A lover may be a confidant, a political ally, or a friend who occasionally oversteps the boundaries of propriety. Physical intimacy is neither guaranteed nor central to the role. What matters is loyalty and the capacity to move through different spheres without betraying her. But her growing network, like any well-stocked library, requires maintenance. She writes letters in her own hand, often in elegant Italian, to those who might drift away. She sends costly gifts when distance threatens to erode an attachment. And, when necessary, she edits removing individuals whose ambitions make them dangerous to keep close. One such removal involves a young Gascon poet whose flirtations with both Catholic and Protestant leaders make him a liability. Margaret quietly arranges for him to receive a diplomatic post in Florence, where he can be admired from afar and pose no threat to her delicate balancing act. In these years, she also begins writing her memoirs, not as a formal historical work, but as a private exercise in recollection. Her tone is neither bitter nor boastful. She writes in the calm, deliberate style of a librarian cataloguing rare works. In her pages, people are described as if they were volumes, some richly bound but empty within, others plain on the outside, but containing treasures of insight. Yet no library is immune to fire. In 1585, tensions between Catholics and Protestants escalate again. and Margaret's position becomes untenable. She attempts to secure a degree of autonomy by establishing herself in again a city where she hopes to rule as an independent power. But the move is risky. The city's loyalty is divided, and her collection of hearts so carefully maintained in Paris cannot easily be transplanted intact. As she settles into her new surroundings, the question hangs in the air: can the volumes she has collected over the years, these carefully chosen companions, allies, and friends, be relied upon in the turbulence of a frontier city? Or will some prove to have been bound in false covers all along? The city of Again sits on the Garonne River, a comfortable remove from the glare of Parisian court life. Its pace is slower, its markets filled with dried plums and fine woolens, and its air scented more with livestock and river mud than with the ambergris perfumes of the Louvre. For Margaret of Valois, however, Again represents something much rarer than a change of scenery. It is a chance at sovereignty, a place where she might rule in her own right, rather than as an adjunct to a husband, brother, or court faction. But the moment she arrives, the subtle framework of her library of hearts begins to creak under strain. In Paris, her companions and allies existed within the same elaborate web of etiquette and obligation. Here, she must adapt to a political climate in which personal loyalty is tested daily by borderland tensions and shifting allegiances. The Protestant-Catholic divide is more than a matter of theological dispute. Shapes, trade routes, militia loyalties, and the gossip exchanged over market stalls. Margaret attempts to recreate her familiar salon environment, filling her residence with music, literature, and the gentle, layered conversations she knows how to guide toward political ends. She invites local nobles to dine, entertains envoys from neighboring provinces, and places careful trust in a handful of Gascon gentlemen who have followed her from Paris. Yet she senses that the dynamic is different here. In Paris, her companions could afford to be subtle. Here, every interaction feels more transactional. Promises of loyalty are often backed not by shared ideals or affection, but by immediate need coin for troops, land rights, or pardons for relatives. She begins to realize that some of her volumes, once considered rare treasures, were only valuable in the curated light of the Parisian court. Under the harsher illumination of Against realities, their bindings crack, tensions peak when her husband, Henry of Navarre, suspects her of acting too independently and perhaps even plotting with factions opposed to his aims. While much of this suspicion is fueled by political paranoia, there is some truth in it. Margaret has always kept her own counsel, and her loyalty has never been absolute to any single party. For her, allegiances are like books, meant to be consulted as needed, not chained to a single shelf. By the late 1580s, events move quickly. Margaret's position in Again weakens as internal disputes among the city's factions make her vulnerable. A failed attempt to strengthen her hold through local alliances turns into a quiet siege of influence. And eventually, her courtly companions, those who had once been her prized volumes, begin to leave. Some go back to Paris in search of more lucrative positions. Others attach themselves directly to Henry of Navarre or to rival noble houses. The collapse is gradual but unmistakable. Without the intricate network she once maintained, Margaret's influence contracts to the walls of her own residence. She still receives letters from loyal friends in Paris, still keeps a mental record of who might return to her side if the tides turn, but the library is now a fraction of its former size. In 1586, she is compelled to surrender again and retreats into a period of enforced quiet. eventually finding herself in confinement at Usen, a remote castle in Auvergne. Paradoxically, this seclusion gives her time and space to reflect. It is here that she continues her memoirs, recording not only her public adventures, but also the private cataloguing of relationships that had defined so much of her life. From the high windows of Uson, she can see miles of forested hills. It is a world away from the candlelit salons of Paris, but she writes with the same careful precision. Her reflections on her companions, lovers, allies, confidences, not bitter. Instead, she treats them like books in a library she no longer owns. Some borrowed and never returned. Some sold off under pressure. Others lost in the confusion of political upheaval. In her later years, she would return to Paris and even reconcile, to a degree, with Henry of Navarre, by then King Henry IV. Her reputation as a collector of lovers would follow her, reduced in popular imagination to gossip and scandal. Yet for those who looked closer, her Book of Hearts was never merely about romance. It was a survival strategy, a record of human connections cultivated in an era when a woman at court had few tools of power beyond her own wit and the loyalty she could inspire. Margaret of Valois knew that people, like books, could be beautiful, informative, deceptive, or dangerous, and that knowing which was which could mean the difference between survival and ruin. But even she could not predict which pages would hold when the shelves began to shake, and perhaps that is why. Even at Usen, she continued to turn the pages in memory, wondering which unwritten chapters had been lost, and which might still be waiting for her, somewhere beyond the castle walls. The air inside the royal apartments of 17th century Stockholm is cold enough to turn candle wax stiff. The palace is a fortress more than a pleasure house, thick walls, narrow windows, and the faint smell of wool cloaks drying after a day in the snow. But Christina of Sweden, barely into her 20s, has little interest in the heavy ceremonies of monarchy. If she could have her way, the throne room would be replaced with a theatre stage. The marble columns traded for painted scenery, and the courtiers transformed into actors speaking lines of her choosing. Christina was born in 1626, the only surviving child of King Gustavus Adolphus. From the start, her life was scripted for a role she never entirely wished to play. Her father, a brilliant military commander, died when she was just 6, leaving her an heiress to a war-weary kingdom in the middle of the 30 Years' War. The court expected her to marry well and produce heirs. Christina, however, began rewriting that expectation before she could even wear a crown. Educated like a prince rather than a princess, she devoured Latin texts, debated politics with her tutors, and studied philosophy until the early hours. She wore men's boots when it suited her, refused to powder her hair, and admitted to finding hunting more tedious than an afternoon spent in the library. Yet it wasn't until she reached her majority in 1644, becoming queen in her own right, that her court began to see just how unconventional her reign would be. Christina treated the throne as a kind of balcony seat from which she could watch the performance of European politics. Rather than focusing on the routine of governance, she poured her attention and the royal treasury into collecting art, manuscripts, and, most importantly, people. She had a taste for intellectual company, surrounding herself with philosophers, scientists, and poets from across the continent. These gatherings, in her mind, were the true theatre of power. But Christina's affection for drama was not limited to books and debates. She adored theatrical productions and, when no playhouse was available, created one within the palace itself. She oversaw costumes, staged scenes, and even directed the actors. sometimes offering impromptu performances of her own. The court whispered that she did not merely direct from behind the curtain. She stepped onto the stage in life as she did, in art, assuming roles and discarding them at will. It was within this blend of politics and performance that her most notable relationships began to unfold. Christina's leading ladies and supporting actors were not limited to men of rank. Her closest companion, Countess Iba Spa, was praised by the Queen as beautiful beyond all mortal description. Christina's letters to Iba, while following the elaborate compliments of the age, often carried an intimacy that suggested more than mere courtly friendship. "I love you beyond all reason," she once wrote, sealing the message with a flourish that left her advisors uneasy about how the court might interpret such words. This openness to affection across expected boundaries both fascinated and unsettled her courtiers. In a Protestant kingdom where decorum and restraint were virtues, Christina's willingness to stage her own personal entanglements as part of court life seemed almost provocative. Yet she treated love, like politics, as a kind of theatre, a play in which every player knew their role but might improvise at any moment. Foreign envoys reported home with mixed impressions. Some saw her as a dangerously unconventional monarch who neglected state business for personal amusements. Others admired her cosmopolitan tastes and her refusal to conform to narrow definitions of royalty. To the Venetian ambassador, she was a queen in mind as well as body, but with the habits of a philosopher and the whims of a poet. As the 1640s wore on, Christina's taste for theatre grew bolder. Masquerades became regular events at the palace, with the Queen often disguised in elaborate costumes, sometimes male, sometimes female, often deliberately blurring the distinction. Her love affairs, too, took on the air of performances, carefully timed entrances, dramatic confrontations, and the occasional intermission where a former favorite was set aside only to be brought back for a second act. Still, beneath the glitter of her court's entertainments lay a practical truth. Christina was using these relationships, however warm or playful, to knit together a network of loyalty. Just as Margaret of Valois had done decades before, Christina understood that affection could be a political tool. A gift of silk for a favored companion was not merely a romantic gesture. It was an investment in influence. By 1650, as pressures mounted for her to marry and secure the dynasty, Christina's theatrical management of her personal life became more difficult to sustain. Her performances with certain companions were beginning to overshadow her political stagecraft. The question hanging in the cold Stockholm air was whether the Queen could continue to direct her own script or whether the kingdom itself would demand a rewrite. And in the wings, behind the velvet curtain, new players were already waiting to step into her spotlight. By the early 1650s, Queen Christina's Stockholm court had become something like an ongoing, improvised play, one in which diplomacy, art, and personal intrigue blurred so seamlessly that it was difficult to tell where politics ended and entertainment began. Foreign visitors entered a world of deliberate spectacle. Tapestries depicting ancient battles hung beside newly imported Italian stage curtains. The scent of beeswax candles mingled with that of oranges and cinnamon brought in from distant ports, luxuries in Sweden's harsh northern climate. And in the middle of it all, Christina, draped in whichever ensemble suited her mood, sometimes in the brocade gowns of a queen, sometimes in the doublet and hose of a gentleman traveller, and sometimes in garments that defied either category altogether. For the Queen, each choice was layered with meaning. A man's riding boots allowed her to move more freely during hunts or rehearsals. but they also served as a subtle reminder to her courtiers that she was not bound by the rules that governed other women. Silk gloves embroidered with theatrical masks hinted to those who paid attention. At her ongoing devotion to the stage, Christina's relationships continued to play out in public, sometimes as comedic interludes, sometimes as tense dramas. Countess Eba Spa remained a central figure, her beauty and charm drawing praise from visiting dignitaries, but the cast of characters grew. Christina's attention shifted periodically to visiting ambassadors, poets, and musicians, each enjoying a season in the royal favor before being replaced by another. If this was a performance, it was not a static one. Christina seemed to enjoy the shifting balance of emotional and political alliances. She could confide in one companion about her philosophical readings, then share a long walk in the gardens with another, discussing everything from hunting dogs to the latest opera libretto sent from Rome. These gestures, though often small, were noticed by her court. An unexpected smile in the council chamber could send ripples of speculation through the ranks of courtiers. Not all were charmed. Members of the Riksdag, the Swedish parliament, grew increasingly concerned about the Queen's apparent neglect of more mundane state affairs. The war that had consumed much of Europe for decades was over, and Sweden had emerged with new territories. But the governance of those lands, the management of resources, and the balancing of alliances required a steadier hand than the Queen seemed inclined to give. Her spending, particularly on artistic and intellectual projects, was another point of contention. Christina saw herself as a patron in the tradition of the Italian Renaissance courts. Her critics saw a monarch draining the treasury for personal amusements. When she commissioned Italian artisans to design elaborate stage sets for a new palace theatre, the expense caused grumbling among nobles already unhappy with the taxation needed to fund Sweden's military obligations. Yet Christina defended her priorities with the same conviction she used to defend her personal freedom. The arts, she argued, were a civilizing force, a means of elevating Sweden from a remote northern kingdom to a cultural power. To her, the presence of Italian musicians and French actors in Stockholm was as important as the presence of generals and diplomats. It was in this climate that whispers began to circulate, not merely about her lovers, but about her intentions for the throne itself. Christina had long resisted marriage, dismissing suitable suitors from both Protestant and Catholic realms. Some suspected that her unwillingness was less about independence and more about a plan to step away from the monarchy entirely. Others believed she simply enjoyed keeping everyone guessing. Her closest companions, however, saw hints of restlessness. There were moments, between rehearsals and late-night philosophical debates, when the Queen would grow unusually quiet, gazing out over the icy waters beyond Stockholm's walls. She spoke of warmer countries, of Rome's art-filled streets, of the great libraries of Paris, and she spoke of the constraints of sovereignty, how a queen's every action was judged, how even friendship could be misread as scandal. One winter evening, during a private gathering lit by the soft glow of oil lamps, she confided to Eba Spa and a few trusted courtiers, "Perhaps my life is not meant to be a crown upon a head, but a mask upon a stage." Whether she meant it as a metaphor or a plan was unclear, but it was the kind of statement that lingered in the air long after the candles had burned down by 1654. The rumors crystallized into something more tangible. Christina began quietly preparing for what would be the most dramatic act of her reign, one that would take her far from the frozen halls of Stockholm and into a warmer, far more complex stage. The question was no longer whether she would rewrite the script of her life, but what role she intended to play once she left Sweden behind. By the spring of 1654, Queen Christina's court was quietly thrumming with an energy that no tapestry or ceremony could disguise. The Queen's behavior, already famously unpredictable, had become even more difficult to read. She attended some council meetings with unusual diligence, only to skip others entirely. She ordered new court entertainments, then spent days in private study. She laughed easily at banquets, yet her eyes often seemed fixed on some point beyond the high, painted ceilings. It was during this season that Christina began to move her most trusted possessions into private storage. Her manuscripts, her collections of antique coins, the more precious works of art, these she arranged to be sent discreetly toward the southern ports. A few among her inner circle understood that such acts were not preparations for a marriage, as the gossip mongers claimed, but for a departure. The formal announcement came in a manner so understated it startled the assembled nobility. In May 1654, Christina informed the Riksdag that she intended to abdicate the throne in favor of her cousin, Charles Gustaf. She cited the weariness of rule and her lack of desire to marry or produce an heir. She spoke in her steady, unhurried way, as though she were explaining an administrative detail, not the end of an era. Behind her calm words was a more complicated truth. Christina had been corresponding through discreet channels with Rome. She had long been drawn to Catholicism, its art and ceremony, its intellectual traditions, and its freedom, ironically, for her from the political obligations that bound a Protestant monarch. Conversion was unthinkable for a Swedish queen, but as a private citizen it became possible. On June 5, 1654, the abdication took place in the great hall of Uppsala Castle. The scene was recorded in detail. Christina, wearing a plain white gown, stepping forward to remove the crown from her own head, then laying down the royal orb and scepter. Witnesses noted her composure, her almost theatrical grace, as if she were delivering the final lines of a long-rehearsed play. Once freed of her title, she wasted little time. Traveling south in a small, swift-moving entourage, she passed through Denmark and Germany, her arrival in each city prompting both curiosity and confusion. Some towns greeted her with celebratory processions. Others regarded her with suspicion, wary of hosting a wandering former monarch with a reputation for personal scandal and intellectual independence. When Christina finally reached Rome in late 1655, she entered not as an exiled queen, but as a spectacle in her own right. The papal court had prepared for her arrival with a kind of festive anticipation. Streets were lined with banners, church bells rang, and artists prepared allegorical scenes depicting her as a modern Minerva. Her conversion to Catholicism was both a personal act and a political triumph for the Church of Protestant. Queen who had crossed the confessional divide of Europe. Life in Rome suited her more than the icy formality of Stockholm. She wandered the palaces of her new friends, attended the opera, and debated art and philosophy with some of the most celebrated minds of the age. Her salons became places where diplomats, poets, and scholars mingled, often blurring the boundaries between formal discussion and playful intrigue. Her personal life continued to draw attention. The old rumors of lovers were replaced by new ones: Roman nobles, visiting French intellectuals, even the occasional musician. Some of these relationships were exaggerated by gossip, others were understated by history. Christina herself seemed amused by the endless speculation, occasionally planting misleading hints in conversation just to see which stories would take root in the years that followed. She would involve herself in the politics of the papal court, in artistic commissions, and in occasional diplomatic efforts, self-appointed and only loosely successful. But she remained, above all, a figure of curiosity and conversation. Even when her influence waned, her life retained the qualities of a performance, unpredictable, deliberate, and more concerned with style than with the approval of the audience. She died in 1689 in Rome, having left behind no children, no permanent political legacy in Sweden, and no clear narrative for the historians to agree upon. Instead, she left a trail of portraits, letters, and carefully staged memories, a reminder of the queen who treated the throne like a role in a play and the world as her theatre. In the end, one might wonder if Christina ever truly sought love in the way her contemporaries imagined. Perhaps she collected people the way others collected art or books, not for possession, but for the beauty they brought into a particular moment, before the scene changed and the curtain rose again. If you were to stroll through the sandstone courtyards of early 18th century Jaipur, the heat pressing down in slow, golden waves, you might catch sight of a small and peculiar spectacle, a queen, seated on a low cushioned dais, scattering grains for an enormous flock of pigeons. The birds, their soft grey feathers flashing iridescent in the sun, would crowd close, cooing in contentment as they fed. Court servants, ever watchful, maintained a perimeter, as though these plump birds were treasures rather than common fowl. This was Maharani Chandra Bai, the senior queen of Maharaja Sawai Jai Singh II, founder of Jaipur, and a ruler as passionate about astronomy as he was about courtly rituals. Chandrabai was a woman of discipline, piety, and if one believed the less polite court whispers an appetite for both control and the unusual. Her pigeon garden was no idle pastime. It was, in the language of palace politics, a statement. In the Rajput courts of the period, queens were expected to embody the ideals of purdah living within the seclusion of the zanana, the women's quarters emerging only for religious festivals or rare public appearances. But seclusion did not mean insignificance. Within the walls of the zanana, power could be wielded with precision, and influence was often exercised in whispers and favors rather than proclamations. Chandrabai understood this perfectly. The pigeons were her chosen instrument. Feeding them daily was an act of dana or religious charity, thought to bring merit. Yet the birds were also messengers in a very literal sense, to carry slips of paper between her garden and select allies within and beyond the palace. A servant could be questioned. A sealed letter could be intercepted. But a pigeon, few guards bothered to scrutinize them. Her network was small but finely tuned. Through it, Chandrabai kept informed about the shifting alliances in court, who was currying favor with the Maharaja's younger queens, which noble families were quietly amassing resources, and what foreign merchants were whispering about in the markets, all this without leaving her shaded courtyard. Her fascination with pigeons also had a gentler, almost meditative side. Early mornings, before the heat grew oppressive, she would walk barefoot through the garden paths, the sound of wings fluttering softly around her. Court poets, eager to please, wrote couplets comparing her to a goddess surrounded by celestial messengers. Musicians composed light morning ragas to accompany the feeding, giving the scene a rhythm as predictable as the rising sun. Yet even in this seemingly tranquil routine, there were hints of tension. Jaipur in the 1720s was not immune to political undercurrents. The Maharaja was building his famed astronomical observatories, stretching the treasury thin. The Mughal Empire's influence was waning, and Maratha raiders pressed from the south. For the queens, these developments translated into shifting fortunes. A noble family in disgrace one month might be indispensable the next. Chandrabai's position as senior queen gave her status, but not absolute security. Younger consorts, some barely in their teens, were entering the palace, each with their own family connections and ambitions. The Zenana was a place of shared rituals, but also of subtle rivalries, where the competition for influence was conducted through gifts, gossip, and the careful control of information. By keeping her own channel of communication alive, Chandrabai could anticipate changes before they became public. She might send a small offering to a temple favored by a rising courtier's family, or arrange for surplus grain from her estates to be distributed in a quarter of the city where unrest threatened. Each gesture was small enough to appear ordinary, yet deliberate enough to earn gratitude and loyalty. Still, it was not the pigeons themselves that drew the most speculation, but the rare occasions when Chandrabai invited someone from outside the Zenana into her garden. A court musician, an astrologer, an elderly merchant with exotic spices, all someone with knowledge to share, and always under the pretense of some harmless diversion. The pigeons fluttered and cooed while conversations drifted, as though the birds themselves were shielding the exchange. On one such morning, the Maharani was seen speaking at length to a visiting poet from Bikaner. His verses praised the seasons and the moonlight over desert sands, but palace servants whispered that something else passed between them. A folded scrap of paper slipped beneath a tray of pomegranate seeds. Whether these whispers were true or merely the invention of idle minds, they point to the same truth. In Chandrabai's Jaipur, the ordinary could be extraordinary if viewed from the right angle. Even something as unremarkable as feeding pigeons could, in the right hands, become an instrument of quiet authority. Yet, as summer advanced and the mango trees began to ripen, an unexpected guest arrived in Jaipur, woman whose presence in the Zenana would test the limits of Chandrabai's calm authority, and whose arrival would turn the pigeon garden from a place of quiet strategy into a theater of subtle confrontation. The day she arrived, the air in Jaipur carried the dry, metallic taste of an approaching dust storm. Her palanquin entered through the Shanpol gate, its lacquered panels painted with scenes from the Ramayana, and behind it trailed a retinue of servants, dowry chests, and, most tellingly, a group of musicians playing the Chennai. This was not the entry of a concubine or temporary guest. This was the procession of a newly wedded queen. Her name was Maharani Indumati, scarcely 17, with a smile that seemed at once guileless and calculating. She came from a prominent Ratha family in Marwar, one of the Rajput clans whose relationship with Jaipur had been marked by centuries of alliance and rivalry in equal measure. The match had been arranged with great ceremony, not only to strengthen political bonds, but also to secure resources from her father's wealthy estates. From the moment she crossed the threshold of the Zenana, Indumati was placed in the orbit of Chandrabai. Senior queens were expected to instruct newcomers in palace customs, and Chandrabai, outwardly serene, fulfilled this duty with the same meticulous care she applied to her pigeons. She showed Indumati the temple chamber where the queens offered morning prayers, the silver-inlaid water jars brought from Gujarat, and the shaded courtyard where the evening breeze carried the scent of night-blooming jasmine. Yet beneath the formalities there was calculation. Chandrabai studied Indumati's every movement, the way she asked questions, the people she sought out, even the fabrics she chose to wear. The young queen, for her part, seemed equally attentive. She was quick to memorize the names of senior servants and quicker still to charm the Maharaja with playful remarks about his obsession with measuring the heavens. The first ripple of tension came not from the Zanana itself, but from the Maharaja's court astrologer. On a humid afternoon, he arrived at the pigeon garden, bowing deeply before Chandrabai to deliver an unusual message. The Maharaja had ordered that Indumati be given free access to certain parts of the palace library rooms, ordinarily off-limits to women of the court. The library in question was not merely a storehouse of poetry and religious texts. It contained detailed records of land revenues, maps of the kingdom's forts, and correspondences with other rulers. In the wrong hands, such documents could be used to sway political alliances or undermine them. When Chandrabai mentioned this development to her trusted maidservant Leela, the girl's eyes widened. Why would a bride of 17 need to read the accounts of the Amber Treasury? It was a question Chandrabai could not yet answer, but she took note of the pattern. Soon after gaining access to the library, Indumati began cultivating friendships with certain courtiers' wives, particularly those whose families controlled trade routes into Gujarat and Malwa. Chandrabai responded in her usual, measured fashion through the pigeons. She sent messages to discreet allies in the city, inquiring about any new dealings between Malwa merchants and Jaipur's markets. The replies were slow to arrive, but one in particular caught her attention. There had been a sudden influx of fine dyed fabrics from Malwa, offered at unusually low prices. The merchant responsible was a distant cousin of Indumati. If this was a deliberate move, its purpose was still obscure. Cheap fabrics alone could not shift the balance of court politics, but they could endear the new queen's family to Jaipur's traders and artisans. Economic goodwill often preceded political influence. Then came the day of the Ganga festival, when women of all ranks carried clay idols of Gauri, consort of Shiva, through the streets in a slow, rhythmic procession. For the Zanana, it was one of the few times each year when the queens could be seen by the public, though still behind embroidered screens. That year, Indumati's palanquin was draped with fabrics in the exact shade of Jaipur's sandstone walls, a subtle signal of belonging. Chandrabai, by contrast, wore her traditional white and gold, the mark of a senior queen in a pious role. The crowd cheered both, but Chandrabai noticed where the Maharaja's gaze lingered longer. Soon after the festival, a change occurred in the pigeon garden itself. Indumati began appearing there in the mornings, ostensibly to enjoy the cool air and speak of poetry. At first, Chandrabai humored her, offering a polite seat and a bowl of guavas, but the younger queen was observant. She watched the pigeons as though measuring their routes, noting the way certain birds seemed to fly purposefully toward the city. One morning, she remarked casually, "It is said in Malwa that a pigeon who returns 3 times to the same place carries not only grain in its belly, but secrets in its heart." Chandrabai smiled, but she understood the implication. Whether it was a warning, a challenge, or merely idle talk, it meant Indumati was aware of more than she pretended. The dust storms came early that year, and with them, disruptions in the market. Grain prices rose. Merchants whispered about new tolls on caravans traveling from the west. Chandrabai's messages began to suggest that these tolls were being negotiated, not by the Maharaja, but by intermediaries whose loyalty lay elsewhere. It was in this unsettled atmosphere that a piece of unexpected news reached Chandrabai. A certain merchant from Bikaner, The same man who had once carried a hidden scrap of paper in her garden had been seen visiting Indumati's family home in Marwa, and his journey had taken place before Indumati's marriage. The connection was troubling. If the merchant had ties to both queens, then the pigeon garden might no longer be a place of unchallenged control. The question now was not whether Indumati sought influence Andrabai was certain of that, but how far she was willing to go, and what message the pigeons might yet carry that could tip the balance in her favor. The monsoon rains arrived late that year. The delay kept Jaipur in a restless state. Fields cracked under the heat, tempers flared in the markets, and the zenana grew stifling. The women took to lingering in shaded corridors, sipping sherbet made from bale fruit, while fans made from palm leaves stirred the heavy air without much relief. For Chandrabai, the season's discomfort was made worse by the sense that her dominion over the pigeon garden was slipping. It was not that Indumati had openly claimed the space far from it. The younger queen still spoke with deference, still deferred to her on ceremonial matters. But there was an ease in her movements now, as though she no longer considered herself a guest in the garden, but a Kona. One morning, Chandrabai found her there before dawn. The pigeons were restless, beating their wings against the coop doors. Indumati stood quietly, tossing millet in a careful arc. When Chandrabai approached, the younger queen turned and said, "Your birds know me now. They trust me." The words were not boastful, merely factual. That made them more unsettling. A few days later, a pigeon returned from the city with a message ring, something Chandrabai had not used in years. Most of her communications were written on slips of paper folded into tiny triangles, carried without such obvious markings. The ring was a sign of haste. The note inside was brief. Ma were men in the Shampol market, selling grain below tax price. Ledgers altered. Watch the merchant from Bikaner. Chandrabai folded the paper slowly, hiding it in the folds of her sari. She suspected the Maharaja knew little of this maneuver. Grain was power, perhaps. More than jewels or fortresses, and selling it cheaply could earn loyalty from the poorest citizens while quietly undermining the treasury. When she next saw Indumati, the younger queen was wearing a necklace of tiny gold coins, a kamarband that jingled faintly when she walked. It was an old Marwa tradition, worn by women whose families dealt in trade. The meaning was clear enough. Wealth could be carried on the body, moving freely past gates and guards. That evening, during a palace feast, Chandrabai noticed that Indumati's cousin had been seated far closer to the Maharaja than protocol allowed. They spoke of irrigation canals, of grain storage, of weather patterns in western Rajasthan. Boring topics to most ears, but to Chandrabai they were as sharp as arrows in the weeks that followed. Chandrabai acted with the caution of a chess player defending her last lines. She released certain pigeons on new routes, not toward the city, but toward the small fort at Amba, where an old ally served as governor. She sent no direct accusations, only observations, prices, names, dates, the kind of dull details that could not be dismissed as gossip. The rains finally broke in mid-July, lashing the palace with wind and water. One night, as the downpour drummed against the zenana walls, Chandrabai awoke to the sound of pigeon wings in the corridor. It was far too late for a flight, yet there they were, a pair of her fastest birds, wet and trembling. Around the leg of one was a strip of paper, written in a hand she did not recognize. The merchant will travel to Bikaner at month's end. Cargo, not grain. Guard the northern road, no signature. No seal. In the days that followed, Chandrabai considered what to do. The message could be genuine, or it could be bait. But if it was genuine, then Indumati's family was moving something more dangerous than grain, perhaps weapons, perhaps documents. She made her choice quietly. The Maharaja never learned the full reason why the northern road was suddenly manned with extra guards, nor why a caravan bound for Bikaner was searched and turned away. The official story was a matter of improper documentation. Indumati said nothing about it, though her visits to the pigeon garden grew less frequent. She smiled when they met, but it was the smile of someone who understood the boundaries had been drawn. In time, the market prices stabilized, the grain caravans returned to their usual routes, and the merchant from Bikaner was seen only occasionally. Yet Chandrabai knew the quiet battle was not over. It never truly ended in the Zenana. Queens came and went, but influence shifted in currents so slow and dull they could be missed entirely, unless one was watching the pigeons. Years later, when Chandrabai had grown old and her walks to the garden became rare, she would sometimes hear the flutter of wings at dawn and wonder if somewhere a younger queen was feeding the birds with the same careful arc of the hand-learning as she had, that even the dullest messengers could carry the weight of a kingdom's secrets. You wake to the slow creak of shutters in the Mantuan dawn. The air smells faintly of the Po river mud, water plants, and the faint tang of fish stalls already being set up in the piazza. The city is quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs only to early morning, when even the palace servants move with deliberate slowness. The year is 1490, and Isabella d'Este is 19 years old. She has been Marchioness of Mantua for barely a year, and already she understands that marriage is not the end of the game, is the first square on the board. Mantua is small compared to the great powers of Italy, the duchies of Milan and Ferrara, the Republic of Venice, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of Naples all jostle for position, their alliances shifting like the tiles in a mosaic. Yet the Gonzaga family's Isabella's in-laws have ambitions far larger than their modest territory would suggest. In this Italy, war is common, but so are banquets. Poisonings and poetry occupy the same evening without scandal. Love affairs are often discussed in the same tone as trade agreements, a matter of value, leverage, and timing. Isabella, raised in the glittering court of Ferrara, has learned early that desire and politics are intertwined like the threads in the silk her city exports. She sits at her studiolo, a small private chamber lined with painted panels showing scenes from the Muses' realms. It is a place where she can read, write letters, and conduct the quieter business of power. On the desk before her are 3 letters, each from a different man. None of them is her husband. One is from a poet in Venice, who writes with careful longing about her musical skill. Another is from a cardinal in Rome, who hints at a shared interest in the reform of church music. The third is from a diplomat in Milan, whose handwriting tilts just enough to suggest a hurried hand, as though written in stolen time. Isabella's eyes rest on the Milanese letter. The man is charming, but more importantly, he is close to Ludovico Sforza, the most powerful man in Milan, and a key player in the politics of northern Italy. A flirtation here is not simply pleasure, it is a potential alliance. A rook moved into position. Her husband, Francesco Gonzaga, does not object to these exchanges. In truth, he engages in similar games himself, though with less subtlety. In the Renaissance courts, a wife's beauty and wit could be as valuable to a family as a fortress. Isabella's charm at banquets, her cleverness in correspondence, her ability to turn admirers into allies. All these were assets that could be traded if handled well. Still, there are boundaries. Isabella never risks outright scandal. Her letters are careful, layered with plausible deniability. She is fluent in the art of half-promises, where every compliment has two possible meanings, and every request is wrapped in poetry. This morning, she dips her pen into ink and begins her reply to the Milanese diplomat. She thanks him for his latest verses, praises his skill, and then, almost as an afterthought, asks about the health of his patron, Ludovico's sister. It is a question designed to remind him that she sees beyond the personal. Outside, Mantua stirs. The Gonzaga guards shift at their posts, merchants open their shops, and the clatter of carts grows louder on the cobbled streets. Isabella folds the letter and seals it with wax stamped from her personal signature. Kneeling Pegasus, her ladies-in-waiting, arrive to dress her for the day. Layers of silk, a girdle studded with enamel, and a bolso, a rounded headdress that frames her face like a halo. Today there will be an audience with an ambassador from Ferrara, and later, music in the great hall. She will smile at her husband's side, listen politely to diplomatic proposals, and perhaps, in the pauses between formalities, exchange a glance. Across the room with a man who will carry her words back to another court in Mantua. As in chess, the opening moves matter most, and Isabella d'Este has just begun hers. By the middle of the 1490s, Isabella d'Este's name had begun to drift far beyond the Po Valley. Courtiers in Rome spoke of her as a second Minerva. Poets in Florence traded rumors about her beauty. Painters in Venice speculated about how they might persuade her to commission their work. For Isabella, this was not idle flattery, with strategic currency. In the Renaissance, reputation was a coin more enduring than gold, and hers, carefully cultivated, was worth entire caravels of it. The court of Mantua was smaller than its rivals, but Isabella made it feel like the center of Italy. She organized elaborate banquets that doubled as diplomatic theaters. Ambassadors would find themselves seated beside rivals, their conversation lubricated by sugared wine and the soft strains of the viol. Every course of the meal was arranged with a subtext, the rare candied orange from Naples as a hint towards southern alliances, the Lombard cheese to flatter Milanese guests. When a visiting envoy praised her lute playing, Isabella would smile and ask about his lord's interest in Mantuan textiles. When a courtier offered her a poem, she might request a report on troop movements in the Romagna. No favor was ever without its counterweight. Her correspondence multiplied. She wrote to Ludovico Sforza in Milan with elaborate politeness, sending small gifts, embroidered gloves, pressed flowers that could be interpreted as tokens of friendship, or, if one preferred, affection. She exchanged verses with Pietro Bembo, the celebrated Venetian humanist, in a style that danced just on the border of impropriety. Meanwhile, her marriage to Francesco Gonzaga became a public alliance and a private formality. Francesco, a condottiero, by trade, often spent months away commanding armies. When he returned, it was usually to boast of military campaigns and, occasionally, to bring her trinkets from distant cities. Theirs was a pragmatic union to people bound by the shared understanding that power was best maintained in tandem, even if affection was portioned elsewhere. But the board was shifting. Ludovico Sforza's influence began to waver under French pressure. Naples and Milan were caught in a dangerous dance with the invading armies of Charles VIII of France. Isabella watched with keen eyes, knowing that every shift in power meant a rearrangement of affections and alliances. One evening, during a masquerade in Mantua, Isabella danced with a tall man wearing a Venetian mask. His step was sure, his voice low, and though his identity was never spoken aloud, she knew from the shape of his hand when it rested at her waist. This was no ordinary guest, this was a trusted aide to a Venetian ambassador, one whose proximity to the Doge was whispered about in more than one court. Their conversation was light, discussing music, fabrics, and the strange weather in Venice that year, but beneath each line ran the current of something else, a subtle offer of influence, a possible exchange of favors, the opening of a diagonal path on the chessboard. Back in her studiolo, Isabella considered her next moves. Should she pursue this Venetian connection, or strengthen the Milanese one? Her instinct told her that Milanese star might dim, while Venezuela was cautious. Always wealthy would remain a steady power. But nothing could be done rashly. She began drafting letters to both sides, careful to give each the sense that they held her exclusive regard. Compliments were distributed like pawns, small, numerous, and expendable. Invitations to Mantua were extended just often enough to keep the game alive. The city around her carried on with its rhythms, artisans hammering out silver buckles, monks walking silently to the cathedral, fishermen selling their catch along the riverbank. For them, the fate of Italy was decided in distant battlefields. For Isabella, the true campaign was waged in ballrooms and on parchment. One evening, as she sat arranging a bouquet of lilies for her chambers, a letter arrived from the Venetian aide. It contained a single line the Doge is curious about. Your opinion on the Neapolitan dispute. It was an invitation disguised as a questioner, bishop poised mid-board, ready to alter the game. Isabella smiled faintly. The middle game was unfolding exactly as she had planned. But in chess, as in life, even the most skilled player must anticipate an opponent's unexpected move, and somewhere, in the courts of Italy, an unexpected move was already in play. By the turn of the century, the Italian chessboard was scattered with fallen pieces. The French had marched into Naples and then out again, leaving broken alliances and humbled cities in their wake. Milan, once so formidable under Ludovico's, now trembled under the threat of foreign garrisons. Venice steady, calculating, Venice remained intact, its merchants trading as if war was simply a seasonal inconvenience. Isabella d'Este moved through this shifting landscape as if nothing had changed. Her salons still glittered with musicians. Her letters still traveled along well-oiled courier routes. Her wardrobe still outshone those of visiting duchesses. But beneath the calm surface, her strategies had shifted entirely. From Venice came subtle promises, commercial privileges for Mantua's merchants, discreet political backing in the Gonzaga family's territorial disputes. From Milan, now desperate for allies, came richer offers, tapestries, jewels, even whispered talk of territorial concessions. For Isabella, this was the final phase of the game. In public, she spoke warmly of her dear friends in both cities. In private, she weighed their value with the dispassionate precision of a player counting the points left on the board. One winter morning in 1500, news arrived that Ludovico Sforza had been captured by the French at Novara. Milan's night had fallen. For many, this was a disaster. For Isabella, it was a signal. The Venetian alliance must now be cemented. Her letters to Venice grew warmer, more personal, even slightly daring in their wordplay. The aide who had danced with her at the masquerade became a frequent correspondent, their exchanges thick with metaphors about ships in safe harbors and the currents that carried them. Her words hinted at loyalty, perhaps even affection, but never commitment. A queen in her own court could not afford to be anyone's pawn. Francesco Gonzaga, ever the soldier, spent this period embroiled in his own maneuvers, sometimes aligned with France, sometimes with Venice, always thinking in terms of troop movements and fortifications. Isabella, in contrast, built her fortifications out of silks, allegories, and calculated praise. She also acquires quite literally a chess set of extraordinary craftsmanship, carved in ivory and inlaid with gold. Its pieces modelled on classical gods and goddesses. To visitors, it was a curiosity. To Isabella, it was a private reminder that every encounter, every letter, every whisper in the ballroom was part of the same unending match. By 1502, Mantua had weathered the worst of the storms. Venetian trade privileges enriched the city. Isabella's cultural projects, her music, her art commissions, her literary patronage made Mantua a beacon in northern Italy, and her personal reputation, carefully guarded through every rumor and flirtation, remained untarnished enough to command respect, yet intriguing enough to invite speculation. In chess, the endgame is not merely about taking the king, it is about positioning oneself so securely that no countermove can touch you. Isabella achieved this, not by removing opponents from the board, but by making herself indispensable to all of them. She became a piece no one wished to lose, even if they could not quite claim her as their own. On a quiet spring evening, she sat in her studio, a letter from Venice in one hand, a Milanese gift in the other. The war outside the walls had quieted for now, but she knew it was only a pause. Italy would play this game again and again. Her eyes drifted to the chess set. A white queen stood at the center of the board, surrounded by both her own and her opponent's pieces. Untouchable, secure, she smiled. The match was far from over, but for now, she had already won. If you had been strolling the streets of Rome in the middle of the 17th century dodging mule carts, skirting around laundry lines strung between windows, you might have overheard her name in a dozen conversations. Hortense Mancini, the niece of Cardinal Mazarin. The niece everyone said was destined for a marriage so advantageous it would make the rest of Europe sigh with envy. Hortense's early life was wrapped in a peculiar sort of luxury, gilded but supervised. As a child, she learned to play the lute in a garden where fountains trickled over carved marble dolphins. Her tutors instructed her in French, Italian, and Latin, as well as in embroidery, the polite sciences, and the complex art of appearing, both modest and dazzling at the same time. This was the Rome of painters and pamphleteers, of Jesuit schools and bustling marketplaces. And in the middle of it all was the formidable figure of her uncle, Cardinal Jules Mazarin, power behind the throne of France during the minority of King Louis XIV. Mazarin had no children of his own, but he had nieces, many nieces, and each of them, he believed, was a porno. A rooken, his personal diplomatic chessboard. Hortense was, in his eyes, perhaps the most promising piece of all. She was clever without seeming calculating, lively without seeming frivolous, and most importantly, her beauty was of the kind that poets compared to dawn breaking over the Tiber. Suitors from across Europe were interested. Princes, dukes, ambassadors, they all came to Rome with gifts and offers. In 1661, when Hortense was about 15, Mazarin orchestrated what he considered a coup. Her marriage to Armand Charles de la Porte, the Duc de la Meilleraye. The match brought her immense wealth. Her dowry alone was one of the richest in France, and an aristocratic title that placed her just a few notches below royalty. But there was a problem, one that even Mazarin, for all his political acumen, had underestimated. Armand Charles, for all his titles and lands, had a temperament that could turn the most comfortable palace into a prison. He was pious in the extreme, not the gentle piety of daily prayers and charity, but a zeal that saw temptation lurking in the folds of a curtain. He ordered nude paintings destroyed or draped over. He had the statues in their garden chiseled to remove any anatomical impropriety. He was known to interrupt conversations if he deemed the subject insufficiently moral. And he was perpetually suspicious of Hortense's laughter, her friendships, even her reading habits. The most chilling sign came early in their marriage. He tried to prevent their female servants from milking cows because he thought the act indecent. To Hortense, who had been raised in an environment of wit, art, and social interplay, this was not simply inconvenient, was suffocating over the next few years. The gilded palace in which she lived became less a stage for her charm and more a labyrinth of surveillance. She was shadowed, questioned, and subjected to her husband's erratic moods. The fortune she had brought into the marriage, her dowry, her jewels, her estates, was effectively under his control. Asterisk. And yet Hortense did not fold into quiet obedience. She had been trained too well in the art of social survival. She began to gather information about her husband's legal rights, about the movements of sympathetic relatives, about the geography of France and the routes that might carry her far from his reach. The first seeds of escape were sown in whispers and in seemingly trivial conversations at court. She cultivated allies, not just the obvious ones, but the overlooked, a coachman here, a chambermaid there, an older noblewoman who had her own reasons for disliking the duck. By the time Mazarin died in 1661, leaving his vast fortune in a complicated tangle of inheritances, Hortense was already considering what no well-born Frenchwoman of her station was supposed to contemplate. Running away, leaving would mean scandal, and scandal could mean ruin. Yet staying would mean something worser, slow erasure of the person she knew herself to be. One evening, at a reception in Paris, she danced longer than was strictly polite. Some whispered it was simply vanity. Others suspected she was making a point that her body, her time, her joy were hers to command. If only for a few hours. What few realized was that she was testing the boundaries of her husband's patience, measuring the temperature of the court's opinion, and quietly imagining what it might feel like to keep dancing out the door, down the street, and away into the night. The question was not whether she would go. The question was how soon and how far. When Hortense finally left her husband's house, it was not with a theatrical farewell, but with the quiet precision of a military maneuver. She had learned enough about her husband's obsessions to know that any obvious preparation, any new luggage, any change in routine would arouse suspicion. So she wore the same gown she might have worn to visit a relative, kept her jewelry modest, and spoke of an afternoon ride. The truth was that this ride would carry her beyond the city gates and into a chain of pre-arranged shelters. One friend offered her a discreet apartment in the Marais district. Another arranged for horses to be ready on the road toward Lyon. The journey would require speed and a constant awareness of who might be following. The Duc de la Mille was not a man to accept defeat lightly. She knew that once he realized she was gone, he would use every connection, every legal tool, to drag her back. Travel in 17th century France was not comfortable, even for the wealthy. The roads between towns were often little more than packed dirt, riddled with potholes and ruts that could snap a carriage wheel. Rain could turn them into deep mud. Frost could make them treacherously slick. Inns varied from decent to squalid, and even the best could not be counted on for privacy. Hortense often insisted on continuing through the night, stopping only at houses where her allies had vouched for the inhabitants. Her path south was deliberate, avoiding the more obvious routes where the Duc's men might wait. Each stage of her journey was a small victory, crossing the Loire without being recognized, persuading a suspicious tollkeeper to let her pass without too many questions, finding a sympathetic merchant who would sell her supplies without word, getting back to Paris. As she traveled, she heard rumors of the hunt for her. Letters were being sent to local magistrates, warning them to detain her if she appeared. At one posting station, she overheard a man reading aloud from a broadsheet that described her as a wife fleeing her lawful husband in defiance of God and society. She kept her head down and pretended not to understand French, answering questions in Italian. The further she traveled, the more she realized that she could not remain in France at all. The Duke's influence stretched across the kingdom, and the laws of the day offered little protection for a runaway wife, no matter how wealthy or wronged. There was, however, one place she knew she might find both distance and some measure of safety: her sister Marie, who was married to the Duke of Savoy in Turin. Crossing into Savoy meant entering a new political world, one where French law could not easily reach her, but the Alps were no small obstacle. She would need to cross them before winter made the passes impassable. Her party reduced now to a handful of loyal descendants, prepared for the climb with whatever provisions they could carry: dried meat, wine, cloaks lined with fur. The horses struggled on the narrow, icy paths, and more than once the travelers had to dismount to lead them along cliffside tracks. When at last they descended into Turin, it was with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Marie welcomed her with open arms, though the reunion was tempered by the knowledge that Savoy itself was not entirely beyond the reach of French diplomats. The Duc was already petitioning for her return. In the months that followed, Hortense experienced an odd kind of limbo. She was free from her husband's immediate control, yet not free to move about without caution. She and her sister attended balls and receptions, but always with an awareness that the wrong conversation, the wrong alliance, could lead to pressure from Paris. It was during this period that Hortense's taste for nocturnal freedom began to take on its legendary form. While court life in Turin observed the usual formalities, she was known to slip away after midnight, riding through the city streets with a small group of friends, often in men's clothing for convenience. The disguise was practical, but it also became a symbol. Hortense was crafting an identity outside the confines of her husband's authority. Yet, as months turned into a year, it became clear that even Turin was too close. Diplomatic tension grew, and whispers suggested that her husband was considering sending agents, not diplomats, to retrieve her. Hortense began to look beyond the Alps, beyond Italy entirely, and it was then that another idea began to take hold, one that would seem, to most women of her time, unthinkable. She would not simply run from her husband. She would run to England. But why England? And how could a French-Italian noblewoman, pursued by scandal and legal claim, hope to win a place in the notoriously watchful court of Charles II? To understand why England became Hortense Mancini's next refuge, you have to imagine the peculiar mix of politics, personality, and appetite that defined the court of Charles II. In the late 1670s, England was a place of sharp contrasts. Parliament argued about the limits of royal power. Protestant and Catholic factions eyed each other with suspicion, and the court itself was a swirl of intrigue, poetry, gambling, and flirtation. Charles, restored to the throne after years of exile, was known as the Merry Monarch, a king who surrounded himself with wit, beauty, and charm. For a woman like Hortense, intelligent, striking, and accustomed to high societies, a court offered both danger and opportunity. She had, of course, a key connection. Her cousin Mary of Modena was married to the Duke of York, the king's brother and heir presumptive. This family link could offer her protection, and possibly more. The journey to England was itself a gamble. She sailed from France's southern coast under a name not her own, hoping to avoid the attention of French agents. The Channel crossing was rough, the December winds cold enough to cut through her thickest cloak. Her arrival in London was discreet. No trumpets announced her, no court officials waited on the dock. Yet within days, word spread quietly among the fashionable set. Hortense Mancini had arrived. If Turin had been a cage with gilded bars, London was a stage without curtains. Charles received her warmly, offering her lodgings and a modest pension. Rumor had it that he was charmed from their first meeting. Hortense had the skill rare, even among court beauties, of knowing how to be noticed without seeming to demand it. She could discuss art and music with learned men, laugh easily with courtiers, and still hold back enough of herself to keep them wondering. Her midnight rides continued in London, now along the Thames or through the quieter streets of Westminster. She fenced, she gambled, she appeared in public wearing men's riding clothes, which caused as much scandal as it did admiration. This was not the sort of behavior expected of a runaway duchess, but Hortense seemed to thrive on the whispers it created. Her presence at court soon became more than decorative. As Charles's acknowledged mistress, she had influence, not the formal power of ministers, but the subtler sway of conversation, favor, and charm. She helped shape the tone of gatherings, drawing intellectuals, musicians, and travelers into her orbit. Yet life in England was not without its shadows. The Duc de la Meilleraye continued to press his case, sending letters to influential figures, insisting on her return. There were also rivals at court, other women who had Charles's attention. Factions who viewed Hortense as a dangerous Catholic influence in a Protestant realm. Then came the famous duel, not of swords, but of snowballs. One winter afternoon, Hortense and another of Charles's favorites, the Duchess of Portsmouth, found themselves leading opposing teams in an elaborate snowball fight at St. James's Park. It was all in jest, but the court chroniclers treated it like a political allegory, noting who stood with whom, who retreated, who advanced. Hortense laughed at the fuss. To her, it was a game. To others, it was a sign that her position was secure enough to spar openly with one of the most powerful women in England. But security at court was never permanent. Charles's attentions shifted, and though he continued to support her, understood that she could not rely solely on royal favor. She cultivated friendships beyond the palace, writers, artists, philosophers, creating a network of her own. This was, perhaps, her greatest skill, turning exile into independence, turning scandal into a kind of celebrity. By the end of her life, in 1699, Hortense had outlived many of her rivals and remained one of the most vivid personalities of her age. She had danced, fenced, and ridden her way across the map of Europe, refusing to be defined by the man she had married or the laws that bound her. And yet, for all her movement, her nights under foreign skies, her escapes through snowy passes, and across stormy seas, did she ever truly find the freedom she sought? Or was each escape simply the opening move in another game she could never quite win? The Scottish Highlands in the mid-19th century could be a lonely place, even for a queen. Balmoral Castle, perched among the pine-covered slopes and misty peaks, was far removed from the constant political hum of London. Here the air smelled of peat smoke and heather, the sounds of hooves and church bells replacing the clamour of Parliament. It was here, in this quieter corner of her realm, that Queen Victoria formed one of the most unusual and controversial friendships of her reign, her bond with John Brown, a plain-spoken Scottish servant who had become her constant companion by the time Brown entered her service. Victoria had been a widow for years. Prince Albert's death in 1861 had left her in deep mourning, wearing black for the rest of her life. She withdrew from many public duties, seeking refuge in private estates like Balmoral. It was there that Brown, a trusted outdoor servant known for his skill with horses, began to serve her personally. The relationship, as it unfolded, would puzzle courtiers, intrigue the public, and leave behind a trail of letters, some guarded and formal, others surprisingly warm, that historians still sift through in search of clues. Brown was no courtier. He spoke in a thick Highland accent, used direct, even blunt, language, and valued loyalty above ceremony. To Victoria, this was not a flaw, it was a relief. She had been surrounded all her life by flatterers and politicians, people who softened their words and cloaked their intentions. Brown's honesty could be bracing, even shocking, but it was a kind of truth she trusted. The Queen's letters to Brown revealed the delicate balance between formality and intimacy. Many are signed with her initials VRI for Victoria Regina Imperatrixa, reminder of her official status. Yet within the lines are glimpses of a different tone, requests about her health, concern for his well-being, inside jokes about the weather or the condition of the ponies. She sometimes wrote of her feelings in the restrained way of the Victorian age. You have been so good and attentive, and I do not know what I should do without you. For a sovereign who rarely expressed private sentiment to anyone outside her family, this was notable. The letters were not painted in literal pigment, of course, but painted in the sense that each word carried a shade of meaning, some in bold strokes, others in the lightest wash of suggestion. They were messages crafted as much to be read between the lines as on them. The court naturally noticed. Brown's closeness to the Queen was impossible to hide. He accompanied her on rides, guarded her privacy, and sometimes spoke to her in ways that shocked those who had spent their lives bowing. She seemed to enjoy his irreverence. When she was tired, he told her to rest. When she was overburdened, he urged her to take the air. No minister would have dared. Over time, these letters became a kind of lifeline. The Queen's daily routine, audiences, paperwork, ceremonies, was punctuated by small notes to Brown when he was away, and warm replies when he was near. The handwriting was steady, the tone measured, but the undercurrent of reliance was unmistakable. Outside Balmoral, the speculation grew. Was John Brown merely a servant, or something more? Satirical newspapers printed cartoons of Mrs. Brown, a play on the Queen's supposed dependence on him. The political classes whispered about impropriety. The Queen dismissed such talk as ill-natured gossip. And yet, one wonders, did she keep writing to him so faithfully because she saw in Brown not just a servant, but the only man since Albert who treated her as a person before a monarch? Or was the correspondence simply another form of escape, a quiet rebellion written in ink against the strictures of her own throne? At Balmoral, rank mattered less than in London, but it still mattered. Footmen and maids kept their place, grooms tended to the horses, and the royal household maintained its rigid hierarchy even on the edge of the Scottish wilderness. Yet John Brown had a habit of behaving as if such rules applied to everyone but him. He walked into the Queen's presence without the elaborate bows others performed. He addressed her not with the flourishes of Your Majesty, but often with a simple ma'am or even Victoria when they were alone. Breach of etiquette so great that it was the talk of the servants' hall. He called her woman. Once, in exasperation, when she refused to put on warmer clothes for a ride, and she reportedly laughed instead of rebuking him. Brown's letters to the Queen, fewer in number than hers to him, were straightforward and unadorned. He wrote about the health of the ponies, the safety of the paths, or the arrangements for her drives. But even these functional notes carried a tone of protectiveness, sometimes bordering on command, that was unusual for anyone addressing a monarch. When Victoria travelled, Brown travelled too. He accompanied her to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, to Windsor Castle, and on extended journeys to the Scottish Highlands. In his absence, she wrote to him about the weather, her health, and the small domestic details of life that one usually reserves for a trusted friend. Historians examining these letters have debated their meaning for decades. Was this the language of affection, of dependence, or merely the pragmatic exchange between a sovereign and a servant who had become indispensable? The surviving documents suggest that the truth was not one thing, but many. Victoria was a woman of formidable self-control in public matters, but in private she valued the rare souls who could pierce the formality around her. Brown did not flatter her, and she returned that honesty with her trust. Her family, however, was not always pleased. The Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, found Brown's influence irritating. Some courtiers saw him as meddling in affairs beyond his station. Rumours circulated that Brown interfered with access to the Queen, choosing who could see her and when. Still, Victoria persisted in her reliance on him. She rewarded him with gifts, fine clothes, a gold chain, even a house of his own and kept him close at Balmoral. In return, Brown was fiercely loyal. He was known to ride out in the worst Highland weather to ensure the Queen's carriage routes were safe, and on more than one occasion he reportedly confronted would-be intruders himself. The press, ever eager for scandal, began to paint the relationship in a romantic light. Satirical prints depicted Brown as the Queen's Highland servant husband, a term she despised. She ordered friends not to speak of such gossip, but the cartoons kept coming, cementing the public's fascination. And so the letters continued, brief, factual, affectionate, in a restrained Victorian way. Some were lost, some destroyed, others kept hidden until decades after her death. Those that survive form a kind of slow, quiet conversation across years, of service and companionship. Yet one question lingered in the minds of those who saw them. Were they simply the Queen's private notes to a valued retainer, or a fragment of something more personal that could never be spoken aloud? The end, when it came, was abrupt. In March 1883, John Brown fell ill, seriously ill, and the Queen's household braced for the possibility they had long avoided imagining. Influenza turned to pneumonia, and despite the attentions of the royal physician, Brown's health declined. He died on March 27th at the age of 50-6. Victoria was devastated. She ordered her staff into deep mourning, as though for a member of the royal family. The Balmoral staff wore black armbands. The Queen herself, dressed in heavier mourning attire than even after the deaths of some of her closest relatives. Diary entries from those days are uncharacteristically raw. The shock, the blow, the blank, the loneliness, these words give no idea of my feelings, of my suffering at the loss of my dear, faithful Brown, she wrote. For a woman so often guarded in her official writings, the frank grief was striking. The private letters they exchanged became, in the Queen's mind, a sacred record. She guarded them, keeping them in a small locked box, while her correspondence with many others was sorted, edited, and sometimes destroyed by her family after her death. She ensured that Brown's letters were preserved in her lifetime, though. Later, her youngest daughter Beatrice would destroy some while editing the Queen's journals, yet not all were lost. A handful survive, tucked among royal archives and private collections, providing an incomplete but suggestive portrait of their bond. These letters, stripped of modern speculation, show to people deeply entwined in daily life, in weather reports, in the logistics of travel, in the quiet reassurances that are sometimes more intimate than declarations of love. In the years after his death, Victoria commissioned a statue of Brown to be placed on the grounds at Balmoral. The inscription, unusually personal for a royal memorial, read, "Friend more than servant, loyal, truthful, brave, selfless, than whom none more devoted, more faultless, never existed." It was a direct rebuke to those who had mocked their closeness. The Queen did not care to soften her feelings for public comfort. The painted letters she wrote in her later years, so called because of the careful hand and elaborate flourishes she used, carried traces of Brown's influence. In the margins and closing lines, she sometimes included phrases he used, almost as if speaking to him across time. For historians, these documents are less a confession than a window into the human texture of monarchy, where the daily rhythms of weather, clothing, and conversation could mean more than treaties or ceremonies. They remind us that behind every public figure is a private network of trust and affection, often invisible to the historical record, and perhaps that is why, when reading the last surviving letter she sent to him, brief note about the spring crocuses at Balmoral, it is difficult not to feel the ache of a conversation cut short. One wonders if all the letters had survived, would they have changed the story we tell about Victoria, or simply confirmed what she herself inscribed on his memorial, that loyalty and devotion, however formed, are not easily explained to those who have never shared them. If you stand in the gardens of Malmaison on a quiet afternoon, you can still hear the wind rustle through the rows of roses, thousands of varieties, once collected by Empress Josephine Bonaparte. The air is sweet, almost heady, and you can almost imagine her figure, slender and poised, walking slowly between the blooms. Josephine's love of flowers was not simply a hobby. It was a stage, a cultivated world in which politics, romance, and discretion could blend seamlessly. Born Marie Joseph Rose Tasha de la Pédrie in Martinique in 1763, she had grown up with the sense of tropical plants and the languid pace of colonial life. By the time she married Napoleon Bonaparte, she had already survived an earlier marriage, the French Revolution, and the Reign of Terror. Her survival owed as much to her social skill as to luck. The gardens at Malmaison were, at first, a refuge. In 1799, while Napoleon was away on military campaigns, Josephine oversaw the estate's transformation. She employed the botanist Aime Bonpland to gather plants from across the globe: Australian eucalyptus, South African pelargoniums, exotic fruits, and rare orchids. She ordered heated greenhouses so that tropical species could survive the French winter, and yet these lush gardens served another purpose. They were a setting for private meetings, quiet walks, and hushed conversations away from the eyes of the imperial court. Napoleon was famously possessive, but their marriage was never free of strain. He had been smitten with her from their earliest days together, but his absences and her independent nature gave rise to a quiet tension. By the early 1800s, whispers began to circulate among courtiers, not of scandalous scenes in the palace, but of discreet companionships, nurtured in the shaded paths and secluded pavilions of Malmaison. One name that often surfaces in these accounts is Hippolyte Charles, a young and charming cavalry officer. Their acquaintance began years before her coronation as empress, when Napoleon was on the Egyptian campaign. Hippolyte was handsome, witty, and far from the rigid discipline of the military hierarchy, precisely the sort of easy company Josephine enjoyed. Whether their relationship was truly romantic remains debated, but letters and memoirs from the time suggest at least an emotional intimacy. Her hidden affairs were not always matters of passion in the modern sense. Sometimes they were alliances, friendships, or calculated flirtations that secured her position in a court rife with intrigue. The social politics of the time required more than beauty or charm. It demanded a constant negotiation of power, affection, and influence. In this way, the gardens became an extension of her strategy, while the formal salons in Paris echoed with the rigid etiquette of the empire. Malmaison was more relaxed. Visitors could stroll among the flowers, sit beneath arbors, or wander into greenhouses that seemed like tropical escapes. In such settings, conversations could turn confidential about politics, about alliances, about feelings too delicate for the marble corridors of the Tuileries. This dual-role public figure and private negotiator was something Josephine mastered. She was as skilled at reading the expressions of visiting dignitaries as she was at identifying the rarest rose varieties. Each had its own language, and she spoke both fluently, even as she faced pressure from Napoleon for failing to produce. An heir, she held her place in the imperial spotlight longer than anyone expected. Some credited her beauty, others her intelligence. But those who visited Malmaison knew there was another factor: the subtle diplomacy conducted among the flower beds, in the soft shadows where the formal gaze of the empire could not reach. The question that remains is this: were the hidden affairs of Empress Josephine matters of the heart, or matters of survival, or perhaps something more complex that even she might have struggled to define? When one examines the life of Empress Josephine, it is tempting to focus on the public pageantry, the coronation robes, the state balls, the glittering jewels that caught the candlelight of imperial salons. But those moments were only the visible surface. Beneath them ran a quieter, slower current of carefully measured decisions, where the choice of a dinner guest or the seating arrangement at a garden tea could shift the balance of imperial alliances. Josephine understood the nature of court life, that every public gesture was a signal, and every private word a potential weapon. The French Empire, in Napoleon's time, was still precarious. Factions formed quickly, loyalties shifted, and the smallest rumor could be carried like a seed, taking root in the minds of political rivals. For a woman whose position depended both on Napoleon's favor and the good opinion of influential families, managing this environment required near-constant vigilance. Malmaison was her answer to this delicate problem. The estate's gardens were designed not only for beauty, but for movement, winding paths that allowed for conversations to begin and end in stages. Shaded alcoves where a discussion could be paused without being overheard, and long greenhouses where two figures could walk in parallel while speaking in low tones. Here, Josephine met not only friends and confidants, but also ambassadors, wives, influential generals, artists, and even visiting scientists. Sometimes, these meetings were pure hospitality. Other times, they were opportunities to influence decisions far beyond the flower beds. The subject of Hippolyte, Charles, so often mentioned in later memoirs, is only one thread in this tapestry. Other names, like those of the Swedish diplomat, Count Karl von Essen, or the Austrian envoy Count Metternich, appear in correspondence and in the diaries of visitors. Whether or not romance was involved, there is little doubt that Josephine cultivated an air of intimacy with such men. It allowed her to gather information, sense shifts in diplomatic winds, and sometimes steer small decisions in ways favorable to herself or her allies. She did not act alone in this work. Her household staff, particularly her ladies-in, part of the machinery of discretion. They knew when to admit a visitor quietly, when to stage an interruption, and when to keep a guest occupied until another could slip away. In this sense, the hidden affairs of the Empress included not only her personal relationships, but a larger network of confidences and mutual understandings. Napoleon's awareness of this activity remains difficult to judge. He was often away on campaign, and when in Paris, his attentions were consumed by governance and military planning. Some historians suggest that he dismissed rumors about Josephine's private life as idle talk, preferring not to confront what he could not change. Others believe he understood her role as a social diplomat, using her position to soften his often blunt political dealings. What is clear is that the gardens became a kind of counterpoint to the empire's military machinery, while Napoleon's victories were won with artillery and cavalry charges. Josephine's influence advanced through conversation and gesture, through subtle exchanges of trust and favor. The very structure of Malmaison seemed to support this. Beyond the rose gardens, there were private pavilions furnished in light, informal styles so different from the gilded stiffness of Paris. Guests could be made to feel at ease, to lower their guard, and to speak more freely. It was in such surroundings that confidences were given, secrets exchanged, and perhaps affections deepened beyond the limits of propriety. Her choice of botanical acquisitions, too, had a quiet purpose. She commissioned rare plants not only to please herself, but to attract visitors who shared her horticultural interests. Botanists, explorers, and collectors traveled long distances to see Malmaison's collections, often bringing with them news of far-off places and sometimes gossip from distant courts. A visitor might come to admire a flowering camellia and leave having unknowingly provided the Empress with valuable intelligence. By the mid-1800s, whispers about Josephine's discreet attachments had become part of her legend. Whether one believed them or not often depended on one's political loyalties. Supporters saw her as a gracious hostess and skilled mediator. Detractors painted her as manipulative or unfaithful. In truth, she may have been both, and more. The real mystery is not whether she had hidden affairs in the romantic sense, but whether her relationships, whatever their nature, were primarily expressions of personal desire or carefully chosen steps in the greater game of survival within Napoleon's empire. And so, the question lingers, in the quietest moments among the roses, did Josephine think of herself as a lover, a strategist, or simply a woman trying to hold her place in a world built on shifting alliances? By the time Josephine's marriage to Napoleon ended in 1810, the gardens of Malmaison had already outlasted countless rumors, whispered scandals, and political tempests. She was dismissed from the role of empress with the same outward grace she had once used to welcome a guest. But her removal from the imperial household did not mark the end of her influence. Napoleon's decision to divorce her was framed as a necessity for the empire. Lack of an heir was the official reason. Yet for those who knew the currents of court life, there was an unspoken understanding. Napoleon wanted a dynastic match, and Josephine's position had become increasingly vulnerable. The divorce was not the shattering exile it might have been for others. In fact, she retained Malmaison and a generous income, along with the continued affection of many who had once moved through her salons. Freed from the ceremonial constraints of court, she settled into a quieter rhythm, if quiet can describe. A life that still attracted statesmen, artists, and scientists from across Europe, without the need to present herself daily in the glittering and exhausting Parisian circles. She could focus entirely on her estate and its collections. The gardens became even more elaborate, the plant houses expanded, and the library swelled with illustrated botanical works. Some of her visitors were old friends. Others were newer acquaintances drawn by her reputation. There were diplomats, both official and unofficial, who came to her for the kind of conversation they could not have with Napoleon's ministers. There were artists who found her a more generous and steady patron than the empire itself. And, inevitably, there were those who came because they sought something more: personal companionship, a quiet word, or the kind of gentle flattery that carried no risk when given to a woman beyond the reach of political marriage. The names of these companions often elude precise historical record. Letters were sometimes written and sometimes destroyed. Diaries kept by visitors offered tantalizing hints: late walk in the orangery, an evening spent in the smaller drawing room, a note sent in the morning inviting a guest to see a newly opened orchid. Was it friendship, courtship, an echo of earlier intrigues? One story that survives in fragmentary form concerns a visit by the Russian Tsar Alexander I in 1814. After Napoleon's abdication, Alexander stopped at Malmaison, where Josephine received him with her usual mixture of warmth and ceremony. According to some accounts, he lingered longer than protocol required, strolling with her through the gardens in the soft light of late afternoon. Their conversation, recorded in no official document, remains the subject of speculation. Some suggest that he offered her protection in the uncertain days ahead. Others imagine a more personal affection. If Josephine had once used her relationships to influence imperial politics, she now seemed content to cultivate them for their own sake. The games of survival were behind her, the quieter work of tending to her collections and her friendships took their place. Still, the habits of discretion and charm did not fade. She continued to manage her household with precision, knowing when to allow a meeting and when to delay it. Guests left Malmaison feeling they had been part of something both intimate and rare, a conversation that could happen nowhere else. Her final months were marked by a mix of satisfaction and decline. The gardens bloomed as never before, with new species arriving from expeditions across the world, but her health weakened. The winter of 1814-15 was cold and wet, and she spent more time indoors, working on her correspondence and reviewing plans for the estate. On May 29, 1814, Josephine died at Malmaison, aged 50. She was buried nearby, and in the weeks that followed, visitors continued to walk through her gardens, as if expecting to see her at any moment, appearing with a welcoming smile from behind a trellis or through the doorway of the glass house. Her hidden affairs remain partly hidden to this day. Historians debate their nature and importance, but perhaps the most telling evidence lies not in gossip or accusation, but in the lasting impression she left on those who knew her. Whether as lover, hostess, or strategist, she moved through the shifting politics of her age with a grace that was both an art and a defense. And in the quiet paths of Malmaison, among the roses and camellias she so carefully cultivated, her shadow lingers not as the subject of scandal, but as a reminder that influence need not march under banners or wear crowns. Sometimes it blooms quietly, season after season, until the day it is gone. The Russian winter in the last decades of the 18th century could stretch its white fingers across the empire for 6 months or more. St. Petersburg, for all its grandeur, was still a young city less than a century old, and in winter the wind coming off the Neva made the marble facades seem colder than stone itself. It was in this climate, both literal and political, that Catherine II, Empress of Russia, ruled with a pen in one hand and a careful network of human connections in the other. By the time she met Gregory Potemkin, Catherine was no stranger to the complicated business of attachment. She had ascended the throne in 1762 after the depositions, some might say, coup against her husband, Peter III. In the years following, she maintained a succession of favorites, each carefully chosen, each fulfilling a different role in her life. Some were companions, others advisors, still others court ornaments. But Potemkin was different. He was born in 1739, the son of a minor nobleman, and had worked his way upward in the army through a combination of military skill, personal charm, and an unerring instinct for impressing the right people. Potemkin had been part of the bodyguard unit that helped Catherine seize power. In the early days, he was one of many faces in a crowd of ambitious officers. Their real acquaintance began in the 1770s, after Russia's wars with the Ottoman Empire began to open new possibilities for imperial expansion. Potemkin, then a young officer with an erratic but promising career, caught Catherine's attention not just for his soldiering, but for his mind. He was educated at times, self-educated on matters of philosophy, governance, and architecture. His ideas were as grand as they were impractical, and Catherine, a ruler with her own taste for sweeping vision, found him a rare equal in conversation. The first letters between them read like a negotiation. Potemkin was deferential but not fawning. Catherine was warm but still measured. Gradually, the tone shifted. Soon their correspondence became a blend of statecraft and private shorthand. Plans for the Crimea discussed in the same breath as private jokes or subtle endearments. One early letter from Catherine, preserved in the archives, shows her balancing both registers. My dear friend, the matter of the Black Sea fortifications must be decided before the thaw. I await your design sketches with impatience. Do not think that this impatience is only for the walls of stone. For modern readers, the line can be interpreted a dozen ways. Was she merely expressing impatience for his plans, or hinting at a more personal longing? The ambiguity is part of what makes their correspondence compelling. In the winter of 1774 to 75, Potemkin fell ill. He withdrew from court life, and for months the two communicated almost entirely through letters. Catherine sent books, small gifts, and even advice on his health. The Empress, who could order armies into motion, spent paragraphs urging her general to wear warmer coats and eat more broth. If the royal court whispered about the nature of their relationship, and it certainly did, Catherine never allowed the gossip to dictate her behavior. Potemkin was elevated to the rank of count, then prince, and made governor-general of newly conquered territories. His power and influence grew in parallel with his intimacy with the empress. Yet, unlike some of her other favorites, Potemkin never became a constant physical presence at court. The Russian Empire was vast, and he spent much of his time traveling, overseeing construction, managing military campaigns. Their bond was sustained in large part by their letters, dozens of them, written over decades, often in the midst of war or political unrest. As one reads them, it becomes clear that the letters were not simply a substitute for conversation. They were the very architecture of their relationship. Each page was both a record of policy and a thread of personal connection. Catherine used them to tether Potemkin to her court, even when he was hundreds of miles away. In those days, the journey from St. Petersburg to the southern territories could take weeks. Couriers on horseback rode through snow and over frozen rivers, carrying folded sheets of paper sealed with the imperial crest. It is possible to imagine one such courier pausing at a way station in the bleak midwinter, holding a letter that contained, in a single paragraph, orders that could shift the fate of nations alongside a line as intimate as, "Do not forget your gloves, you are too careless with the cold." As winter deepened in early 1776, their correspondence hinted at an unspoken question. Would their partnership remain a purely political alliance sustained by affection, or would it take the form of something more permanent? Some historians speculate about a secret marriage, though no formal record survives. What does survive is the growing warmth of Catherine's language, the way she began signing her letters, not simply as Ekaterina, but with affectionate diminutive, reserved for close friends and lovers. One wonders, had Potemkin not fallen ill that year, would they have seen more of each other in person? Or was the distance, bridged by letters, part of what made their connection thrive? By the late 1770s, Catherine and Potemkin's correspondence had become a kind of second government, one that ran parallel to the official court, ministries, and military command structure. The empress kept her formal orders for public consumption, but the real strategies, the careful reasoning, and the subtle reshaping of policy often passed through their private letters. Potemkin was no mere military instrument. He was a visionary in the sprawling, half-finished sense of the word. He dreamed of ports where there were only fishing villages, of palaces in empty steppe, of a fleet where the shoreline could barely accommodate a shipyard. His imagination was as boundless as the Russian South itself, and Catherine indulged these dreams, though she often reined them in one letter dated to 1780. Catherine's handwriting runs clear and deliberate. You speak of 20 ships, and of the harbors to keep them. I tell you, my dear, that the treasury will allow perhaps 5, unless you are hiding a chest of gold in the Crimea. Still, your ports shall have my support, for the idea is too good to ignore entirely. That balanced practical restraint meeting, grand ambition, was at the heart of their working relationship. Potemkin, for all his charm and capability, could be erratic. He would vanish from court without notice, bury himself in work, and then reappear with an avalanche of schemes. Catherine's letters often acted as both encouragement and anchor, pulling him back toward the achievable dot when war with the Ottoman Empire resumed in 1787. Their exchanges intensified. Catherine entrusted him with supreme command in the south, a role that gave him near autonomous control over vast territories. In return, Potemkin kept her informed not only of troop movements and fortifications, but also of the color of the sunsets in the Crimea, the arrival of exotic fruits from the Caucasus, and the progress of gardens planted in newly built towns. For the Empress, these details mattered. She understood that empire was not only won through treaties and battles, but also through the slow, deliberate weaving of culture into the fabric of conquered lands. Potemkin's notes about orchards and fountains were not trivial, they were reports on the transformation of the empire's face. Perhaps the most striking element of their letters from this period is the way they mixed statecraft with the mundane. One letter might contain, in rapid sequence, instructions on how to negotiate with Tatar leaders, a personal complaint about the cold in his quarters, an inventory of supplies for the fleet, a request that she send more of a particular type of French wine. In one memorable exchange, Potemkin wrote, "If the Turks come by sea, they will meet us with fire. If they come by land, we will starve them with the emptiness of the steppe. As for myself, I have run out of decent candles, and your last gift of lemons was gone in 3 days. I shall require both before I can think clearly again." Catherine replied in kind, "Candles and lemons shall be dispatched at once. The Turks will have to wait for their turn." These were not the sorts of lines meant for historians, or, at least, not for the official histories. Yet they reveal more about the texture of 18th century governance than any decree or proclamation. By the mid-1780s, Potemkin's health had begun to decline again, his energy flickering between periods of frenetic activity and exhaustion. Catherine's letters grew more concerned, though never indulgent to the point of letting him shirk his duties. She reminded him to rest, even as she outlined the next set of tasks. In one winter letter, she wrote, "You speak of retiring, and yet who else will see to the new towns? Do not imagine that I can replace you, but do not imagine either that I will allow you to work yourself into an early grave. There is a constant push and pull here between personal affection and imperial necessity, between the wish to protect and the need to use every ounce of talent her generals could offer." Some scholars have suggested that their relationship evolved into something beyond romance, beyond politics, an enduring partnership in which love, loyalty, and mutual benefit were inseparably tangled. The letters support this view. They were not written in the fevered language of brief passion, nor in the dry prose of formal governance. Instead, they carry the steady rhythm of two people who had learned to inhabit each other's minds across great distances. As the decade drew to a close, one question seemed to hang unspoken in their correspondence. What would become of this partnership when one of them could no longer keep pace with the demands of empire? The Russian winter, after all, did not forgive weakness, and neither did the machinery of state. By the autumn of 1791, the long-running war with the Ottoman Empire was winding toward a conclusion. Russia's victories had extended her influence deep into the Black Sea region, securing ports and fortresses that had existed only in Potemkin's imaginings a decade earlier. Yet the man himself was visibly worn. Potemkin's final campaigns were conducted as much from a writing desk as from a saddle. His letters to Catherine still carried his trademark mixture of military detail and domestic trivia, but their frequency began to falter, and the ink sometimes betrayed an unsteady hand. The Empress noticed immediately in one of her letters from that summer. She wrote with a firmness that suggested both command and care, "You will not go to the front until you are better. The empire can survive a week without you on horseback, but not without you entirely. Do not make me write this twice." Potemkin, never one to submit easily, replied in character, "If I cannot ride, then I will be carried. But do not think I will be absent when the treaty is signed. You would not wish to see the Turks think me already buried. This stubborn determination carried him south once more. He traveled to Nikolov, then to Odessa, meeting with generals, inspecting new towns, and keeping an ever-watchful eye on the Crimean harbors he had fought so hard to secure. Along the way, he continued to send notes to Catherine, sometimes only a few lines reports of weather, shortages, or gossip about foreign envoys. The letters from this final period are perhaps the most revealing. Gone are the long arguments over strategy. In their place are brief affirmations, tokens of connection meant to reassure her that he was still at his post. Catherine's replies took on a warmer, more insistent tone, as though she sensed the narrowing of time. In early October 1791, while traveling toward the front, Potemkin's condition worsened. Accounts differ. Some speak of fever, others of a long-standing illness suddenly made acute by the journey. What is certain is that he did not reach his destination. Outside the small town of Yassy, he collapsed in his carriage and was carried to a nearby house. There, too weak to write, he dictated his last messages. One was to Catherine. The content is uncertain. Some sources claim it was a farewell. Others insist it was merely another set of instructions for the Southern Command. The letter never reached her in time. Potemkin died on October 16, 1791, at the age of 52, when the news reached St. Petersburg. Catherine is said to have locked herself away, refusing audiences for days. She ordered that his papers be collected and sent to her personally, including the correspondence they had exchanged over the years. Many of these letters she kept in her private apartments, away from the eyes of ministers and historians. What survived tells us not only about their shared work, but also about the quiet, unrecorded labor of ruling, of keeping an empire stitched together, not only through orders and laws, but through trust, humor, and mutual endurance. In the decades since, historians have argued over the precise nature of their bond. Were they lovers until the end, friends who had outgrown romance, political allies whose personal connection simply outlasted convenience? The letters offer no decisive answer, and perhaps that is the point. The last winter letters, brief and unevenly written, show two people still speaking across distance, still making arrangements for the empire's future, even as time was closing in on them. In this way, the correspondence becomes a kind of shared legotia, map of what it meant to govern together in an age when letters were the arteries of state, carrying not just commands, but the very pulse of power itself. And perhaps the more enduring question is this: when the ink fades and the paper crumbles, is it the words themselves that preserve history, or the fact that someone, somewhere, cared enough to keep writing them? Asterisk, you can imagine the gardens first, not the formal ones the public saw when they visited Hampton Court, but the smaller, walled retreats reserved for the Queen's private walks. The year is somewhere between 1690 and 1693. Mary II, joint sovereign of England, Scotland, and Ireland alongside her husband William III, preferred the quiet symmetry of roses, lavender, and trimmed hedges over the noisy intrigues of the court. It is in these small green spaces that her most enduring friendships, and perhaps the most curious chapter of her reign, took root. Mary's court, by the standards of her time, was unadorned. She famously avoided the ostentation of her father, James II, whose Catholic sympathies and lavish displays had alienated much of his Protestant subjects. She dressed simply, favored modest entertainments, and seemed genuinely more interested in needlework and devotional reading than in masquerades. Yet beneath this plain exterior, she maintained a network of personal relationships that were quietly strategic. Some were with ladies-in-waiting of high rank, others with companions whose political influence was subtle but profound. It was in its own way a court built like a rose garden, cultivated carefully, pruned when necessary, but designed so that the beauty came from arrangement rather than from rare specimens. Mary did not need the most flamboyant personalities. She needed steady ones. The Queen's closest companions were not always the most obvious figures. While William spent long periods abroad, particularly during military campaigns in the Low Countries, Mary was left to govern in his stead. This meant that her social circle often doubled as a political council, though its meetings did not look like formal assemblies. Decisions might be influenced during embroidery sessions in the private galleries of the palace, or while walking the gravel paths lined with medicinal herbs. Of the better-known figures in her circle was the Countess of Marlborough, Sarah Churchill, who had not yet achieved the political dominance she would under Queen Anne. Sarah was witty, outspoken, and far less inclined toward Mary's restrained piety. Yet she was also fiercely loyal when given her trust, and trust was the currency Mary valued above all. Their correspondence, while not as famous as Sarah's later letters, reveals an undercurrent of mutual reliance. Another companion, Lady Henrietta Hyde, was of a different nature entirely, quiet, devout, and devoted to the Queen's moral vision for the court. Mary liked balance, and her circle reflected it. The lively set to counterbalance the austere, the opinionated to counter the deferential. In her mind, this was not favoritism but harmony. If one were to visit Versailles during the same decade, the contrast could not be sharper. Louis XIV's court revolved around intrigue, rivalry, and a theatre of seduction. In London, Mary presided over something closer to a boarding school for well-bred ladies, or so her critics joked. She discouraged gossip, frowned upon overt flirtations, and insisted that both men and women at court attend regular religious services. It was this moral severity that made her private friendships all the more important. Without the constant buzz of scandal to bind courtiers together, Mary's household risked becoming austere to the point of boredom. Companionship filled the gap. Her ladies became a sort of chosen family, one that could provide emotional ease without sacrificing propriety. Still, this arrangement raised a question at the time. Could a queen maintain true intimacy with those she also commanded? The formal hierarchy between monarch and subject made it difficult to separate affection from obligation. Some whispered that her friendships were a form of soft politics, that a place in Mary's private rooms was worth more than any official court title. The rose, Mary's favorite flower, was not a casual preference. In 17th century symbolism, roses carried multiple meanings: love, secrecy, and divine grace. The phrase sub rosa, under the rose, implied that what was spoken was to remain confidential. Mary's garden walks with her companions were often described in similar terms by contemporary observers. The conversations were pleasant, even trivial, but there was a sense that certain decisions or impressions were formed there that would later influence the Queen's will. We do not have minutes of these strolls, of course. What we do have are fragments. A note from Lady Henrietta requesting a walk to discuss a matter of some delicacy. An account from a visiting Dutch diplomat remarking on the retired air of the Queen's afternoons. A mention in Sarah Churchill's later memoirs about those walks where Her Majesty was most herself. It was in these moments, away from the ceremonial audience chamber, that Mary revealed her personal priorities, often less about military matters or foreign policy, and more about the moral tone of her kingdom, the charities she wanted to support, and the health of her household. Mary's reign was not without political crises. The ongoing war with France, tensions over parliamentary authority, and the delicate Protestant-Catholic balance in her kingdoms. But her personal approach to rule was defined by an avoidance of public drama. She saw stability as a virtue in itself. This was not passivity, but a deliberate style. To govern without unnecessary spectacle, her private circle mirrored this philosophy. No one in it was known for reckless gambles or sudden betrayals. The Queen, in this sense, collected companions the way a scholar might collect well-bound volumes, reliable, durable, and containing knowledge that could be quietly consulted. The image of Mary II as a collector of people is not romantic in the way later courts would interpret such things. There were no celebrated love affairs to stir the gossip sheets. Instead, her relationships were investments in the slow cultivation of trust. And yet, in 1694, a few months before her death, one visitor recorded seeing Mary in the rose garden with a new companion whose name does not appear in earlier lists of her household. Who was this figure, and why did they enter the Queen's circle so late in her life? The surviving records are fragmentary, but the question lingers, like the scent of the roses themselves. The records grow thinner here. In the summer of 1694, Mary II's health was already beginning to falter, though she was not yet confined to her chambers. She spent more time in the gardens, and more of those hours were passed in the company of a woman whose name appears only once in the surviving household. Accounts in a brief notation of clothing expenses for the new gown of Mrs. G, silk of Holland make. Who was Mrs. G? The vagueness was unusual for royal bookkeeping, which typically listed attendants by their full name and title. Some historians have speculated she was a widow of modest but respectable standing, perhaps introduced to the Queen by one of her more established ladies. Others suspect she might have been connected to the Dutch entourage of William III, arriving late in Mary's reign when the Queen was ruling alone during William's absence. What is certain is that Mrs. G was frequently seen with the Queen, not in public audiences, but in those private spaces Mary reserved for her closest companions. The appearance of a new figure in the Queen's intimate circle might have caused a stir at another court. Here, it barely rippled the surface. Mary's household was disciplined in its discretion, and without any hint of scandal to animate them. The whispers died quickly. Still, there is something telling in how Mrs. G is described in one letter from Lady Henrietta Hyde to a cousin. She is much in the Queen's sight, though she speaks little and walks much. A companion who walks more than she talks. This suited Mary's style perfectly. Conversation was not the only currency in the Queen's companionship. Presence itself mattered. Being a steady, calming figure could be as valuable as offering political counsel. Mary's preference for quiet allies was not accidental. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, which placed her and William on the throne, had left her in an awkward personal position. She had, in effect, taken the crown from her father. This made her both a symbol of Protestant legitimacy and, in some eyes, a usurper. Publicly, she was serene. Privately, she must have known that her political survival depended on a network of people whose loyalty was unquestionable. Mrs. G's role, though undocumented in detail, appears to have been one of emotional steadiness. In an environment where every word might be recorded, a companion who did not speak unnecessarily could be priceless. There is an account from the Dutch envoy Everard van Weide that mentions the Queen walking with her shadow, a poetic turn of phrase that almost certainly refers to Mrs. G. It is easy to imagine the two moving through the gardens, the Queen pausing to examine the late roses, her companion silent at her side. By autumn of 1694, the gardens themselves were changing. The blooms had thinned, and the air carried the faint dampness that announced winter. It was during this period that Mary's illness became undeniable. Smallpox had claimed countless lives in her century, and now it was moving toward her, even. As her strength waned, she kept to her walking routine as long as she could. Visitors noted that Mrs. G remained close by, occasionally offering an arm, though never intruding. For a queen who valued dignity and control, this restraint was a form of service as important as any ceremonial duty. Was Mrs. G merely a quiet attendant, or did she have influence over the Queen's late decisions? We cannot say for certain. Some small changes in Mary's charitable distributions during these months, a slight increase to a particular hospital fund. The appointment of a lesser-known chaplain may have been prompted by private conversations, yet without clear evidence, these remain speculations. What is notable is that Mary, whose circle had been stable for years, allowed someone entirely new into her innermost space when her life was nearing its close. Whether this was a gesture of trust, comfort, or perhaps even a calculated move to keep certain tensions at bay, it suggests that her understanding of loyalty was not fixed, but adaptable when needed. The last recorded sighting of Mary in the gardens comes from December 1694. Wrapped in a heavy cloak, she moved slowly along the gravel path, Mrs. G at her side. The court physician noted in his diary that the Queen lingered to watch the gardeners set the last roots for spring. There is a quiet symbolism here, planting for a season she would not live to see. Within a fortnight, she was bedridden. The gardens would bloom again in the spring, but the rose court would no longer be hers. And so the question remains, why did this unnamed figure enter her life at the very end? And what, if anything, passed between them that shaped those last months? The answer is buried with both women, leaving only the faintest trace in the petals of history. When winter deepened in the final days of 1694, the Rose Court, Mary's carefully cultivated world of loyal attendants and quiet routines, was already unraveling. The frost silenced the gardens, and the palace itself seemed to adopt a hush that matched the Queen's condition. The few courtiers still admitted to her rooms spoke of a dim light, a faint scent of dried lavender, and the muffled steps of attendants who knew that every sound would be magnified in those still chambers. The Queen's illness had stripped away ceremony. She no longer attended council meetings or public devotions. Yet the hierarchy of the Rose Court persisted in miniature within her. The women who had walked with her through years of reign, Lady Henrietta Hyde, the Countess of Derby, and now the enigmatic Mrs. G, remained present in varying turns, tending to tasks both practical and symbolic. Mary had always preferred her companions to be present without pressing upon her. Even now, with her strength failing, she resisted overt fussing. Those who remained in her presence were careful not to speak unless addressed. Reading aloud from devotional works was permitted, but the words were often soft enough to blur into background rhythm, a lull rather than a lesson. Mrs. G, whose role had been ill-defined from the start, seemed to find her final purpose in these weeks. She was the one who managed the Queen's letters, not political correspondence, but the personal notes from friends and distant relatives, as well as reports from charitable institutions. Mrs. G would open them, read them silently to herself, and then pass them to the Queen, summarizing only what seemed essential. It was, perhaps, a final act of curation, shielding Mary from the noise of a world she was quietly leaving. Confined indoors, Mary asked often about the gardens. The head gardener, Mr. George London, came to her chambers twice in December, bringing sprigs of evergreen and small potted rosemary plants. These were arranged on a table near her bed. Their fragrance faint but constant. Mrs. G is recorded in the gardener's journal as the one who placed the pots near the light and kept them well watered, an almost domestic gesture that in another life might have been unremarkable. But here, in the waning days of a monarch, such acts took on quiet gravity. One evening, Mary asked Mrs. G to describe the rose beds as they would look in June. Mrs. G, not known for loquacity, reportedly spoke for nearly a quarter of an hour, naming varieties, recalling the pink of the York roses and the deep crimson of the Tuscany, and even describing the sound of bees among them. It was perhaps the longest uninterrupted conversation anyone had heard from her. In the last week of December, William III returned to the palace. His relationship with Mary had been defined by both political necessity and genuine affection, though their time together had often been interrupted by his military campaigns. Those present said he sat with her for hours in silence. Mary's ladies took turns withdrawing to allow privacy, but Mrs. G remained, more often than not, positioned unobtrusively in the corner. Whether this was by the Queen's request or simply an unspoken understanding is unknown. In those last nights, the court around her shrank to its smallest and most loyal form, a king, a handful of attendants, and the mysterious figure who had walked at her side in the gardens only weeks before. Mary, too, died on the morning of December 28th, 1694. The official announcements were dutifully sent, and the machinery of royal mourning began at once. Black draperies, muted bells, the slow preparation for the lying in state. The Rose Court dissolved almost immediately. Without the Queen, the group had no axis around which to turn. The ladies returned to their own households. Some remained in service to William. Others withdrew from court life entirely. Mrs. G disappears from the record entirely after this point. No pension is listed in her name. No note of reassignment to another household. No marriage or death recorded in the immediate years after. She simply vanishes from history, leaving behind only a handful of diary mentions and the one brief expense note from the summer. Mary's reign was not long, but the way she kept her companions speaks to a subtler form of queenship, one that valued loyalty and steadiness over spectacle. The Rose Court was never about lavish entertainments or dramatic intrigue. It was about creating a space in which the Queen could remain herself, shielded from the restless ambitions of the broader court. The presence of Mrs. G in those final months suggests that even in her last days, Mary understood the quiet strength of selective intimacy. She chose her companions not for their titles or wit, but for their ability to hold a place without overwhelming it. The roses bloomed again in the gardens of Kensington the following summer. Visitors admired them without knowing they had been described, in winter, to a dying queen by a woman whose name history barely caught. And perhaps that is the truest measure of the Rose Court's work. Not that it left bold marks in the annals, but that it allowed its sovereign to leave this world in a space shaped by her own quiet choosing. Berlin, in the winter of 1797, was not a city that welcomed warmth easily. The wind from the Spree cut across the cobblestones like a serrated blade, slipping through wool cloaks, rattling shutters, and icing the breath of coach horses waiting in the palace courtyards. But within the high windows of the royal residence, candlelight pooled on silk draperies, polished wood gleamed under beeswax, and the smell of mulled wine and orange peels softened the air. In one such warm salon sat Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, newly crowned Queen of Prussia, her slender hands resting on the carved arm of a gilt chair. She had been queen for barely a year, but her presence was already reshaping the court, not through grand decrees or force of will, but through something quieter, charm, tempered with just enough distance to keep the room leaning toward her. Louise had a particular way of listening that made even the most rigid officer find his story worth telling. She would tilt her head slightly, a single curl falling forward, and her eyes would seem to rest on a speaker as though there were no one else. In the hall, in a court known for military austerity, she was an anomaly, a queen who preferred conversation about poetry to battle reports, who arranged flowers in the antechamber with her own hands, and who wrote letters filled with little sketches of country cottages. It was not long before the Velvet Pavilion, as her inner rooms became known, drew a particular group of visitors. Some were titled, others merely interesting. All were men who found in Louise an unlikely confidant, a Saxon diplomat who had a fondness for amateur astronomy, a French émigré with a talent for watercolors, a Prussian officer whose real passion lay in the cultivation of rare tulips. Each found space at her small evening gatherings, and each would later be counted among the Queen's admirers, though what they admired was often more complicated than romance ***, the reality, as you would see if you lingered at the edge of those evenings, was that Louise's circle was less about flirtation than about escape. Escape from the strict rhythms of court protocol, from the clatter of swords against tile, from the ink-heavy reports of ministers. Here, in the pavilion, voices dropped into softer registers. Chairs were drawn closer to the fire. A decanter of Moselle wine would be passed, slowly, while someone read from a French translation of Ossian's poems. Louise herself rarely dominated these gatherings. Instead, she moved between conversations, asking the astronomer whether the Pleiades were visible this winter, or teasing the officer about whether his tulip bulbs had survived the frost. She took notes for her own pleasure, half diary, half social map, jotting down the stories her guests shared, the phrases that struck her as worth remembering. At the time, these moments seemed almost weightless, the sort of idle courtly chatter that left no mark on the official chronicles. Yet, as later years would prove, the Velvet Pavilion shaped opinions, softened disputes, and in subtle ways altered the course of alliances. The Saxon diplomat might, after all, be more inclined toward Prussian proposals after an evening spent debating constellations over honeycakes. Still, not everyone approved. There were whispers, quiet at first, then louder, that the Queen's taste for these intimate circles was unbecoming. Her detractors, particularly among the older guard of officers, found the mix of foreign guests unsettling. They wondered whether the Queen understood the political risks of showing favor to charming outsiders. Some hinted at romantic entanglements, though the evidence was mostly the kind found in idle rumor. A tool-long glance, a letter folded twice instead of once. Louise was not oblivious. She knew her gatherings were watched, her companions weighed in the scales of court opinion. But she seemed to take a peculiar satisfaction in keeping her critics guessing. She rarely refused an invitation to a state dinner, yet she would slip away early, returning to the pavilion where her chosen company awaited, the same men whose names appeared nowhere in military dispatches, yet who lingered in the footnotes of private memoirs. On one particular January night, snow piling in the palace courtyards, Louise listened to the French émigré describe the gardens at his family estate before the Revolution. The gravel paths lined with espalierde pear trees, the scent of boxwood after rain. She asked questions about the tools used to keep the path straight, about how the trees were pruned. To anyone else, these might have been dull curiosities, but to Louise, they were the small, exact details that made the past real, and therefore worth preserving in the mind. The clock in the corner ticked softly. Outside bells marked the hour for the guard shift. Yet in the pavilion, the night seemed without edges, as though time itself had settled into the slow rhythm of wine poured, words exchanged, and firewood shifted in the grate. One could almost forget that beyond these walls, Prussia was balancing between old alliances and new tensions. Louise herself, though young, had begun to see how swiftly the air of civility could change. Some of the men in this room would one day make decisions in war councils. Others would vanish from court without explanation. But tonight, none of that intruded. Tonight, the Queen was content to let the conversation wander, to keep her questions light, to wrap the pavilion in a kind of diplomatic warmth. And yet, watching her that night, you might wonder whether Louise's warmth was simply kindness, or if it was part of a deliberate design. Was the velvet pavilion merely a place of retreat, or was it a board on which the Queen placed her pieces carefully, each admirer a pawn or bishop in a game that would unfold beyond candlelight? By the spring of 1798, the velvet pavilion had ceased to be an informal curiosity of court life and become a fixture, something ministers now accounted for in their private calculations. No memorandum would admit it, but Louise's evenings had begun to ripple outward in subtle ways, altering the texture of diplomatic exchanges, smoothing certain frictions before they ever reached the formal council chamber. The mechanics were simple enough. A Saxon envoy, nursing a glass of Riesling by the fire, might let slip a concern over troop movements in Silesia. A visiting Dutch merchant, amused by the Queen's questions about maritime trade, might hint at favorable tariff adjustments. Even the most guarded official could be coaxed into a minor revelation when the hour was late and the Queen herself leaned forward, chin resting lightly in her palm, to ask something as innocent as, "And do you think such an arrangement will last the summer?" Louise had no formal diplomatic brief. She had never studied statecraft in the way her husband had studied military drill. But she understood the value of information that arrived unfiltered, wrapped in the comfort of casual talk. The velvet pavilion was her listening post, and if some guests thought of themselves as suitors, so much the better. A flattered man often talks more freely. Her admirers were not a uniform set. Some, like the tulip-obsessed officer, were almost entirely without political significance, their value lying in their ability to lighten the mood and remind more serious guests that the Queen's gatherings were not interrogations. Others, such as the Saxon diplomat or the Swedish attaché, came with clear strategic importance. Louise never pressed them for confidences, but she noticed what subjects made them evasive, what names caused their gaze to shift, what reports they dismissed too quickly. In this sense, her circle was less a courtly diversion than an intelligence network disguised as polite society. There were limits, of course. Louise had no illusions that she could alter the course of Prussian policy single-handedly, but she could, and did, influence the tone of discussions her husband encountered later, making him aware of certain grievances, hinting at opportunities, or softening his view. toward individuals she believed could serve the kingdom well. It was a delicate balance. Too much obvious influence, and she would be accused of meddling. Too little, and the pavilion would wither into mere gossip. Louise walked the middle line, letting her guests feel they were choosing the subjects, even as she guided the flow. Not all of her admirers understood this game. The French émigré, for instance, seemed genuinely convinced that the Queen valued his company solely for his wit and his stories of pre-revolutionary gardens. He grew possessive in small ways, arriving earlier than others, offering her sketches of roses and fountains. Louise accepted them graciously, placing each in a drawer where she kept tokens from many visitors, not as mementos of romance, but as pieces in a larger mosaic of relationships that could be drawn upon later. Her detractors, meanwhile, were sharpening their criticisms. Some ministers muttered that the Queen's preference for soft company made her ill-suited for the hard realities facing Prussia, which was already navigating the pressures of Napoleonic France. They warned the king, Frederick William III, that foreign agents might use her affability to pry into state secrets. The king, for his part, defended his wife's character, but urged her to be cautious. Louise listened, smiled, and made only small concessions. She allowed the guest list to be reviewed more carefully, though she ensured that reviews took place after invitations had already been sent. She moved some of her more pointed conversations into the garden walks of the palace grounds, where the risk of eavesdropping was lower. The velvet pavilion itself became a symbol, and, to some extent, a rumor. Not all who spoke of it had been inside. Some imagined it as a perfumed den of intrigue, others as a harmless social room where the Queen entertained the lonely. The truth was neither entirely tame nor entirely dangerous. One evening in early May, Louise stood at the tall window, watching the last of the light fade over Berlin. Behind her, voices mingled, the astronomer describing a new star chart, the Swedish attaché laughing at something the tulip officer had said. In that moment, the Queen thought about the tension coiling in Europe, about how much of it rested on fragile understandings between men who rarely saw each other outside of formal negotiations. She turned from the window and crossed the room, drawing the Swedish attaché into a quiet conversation about his king's view of Prussian naval policy. It was a subject she had touched on before, always indirectly. Tonight, she asked only one question, a small one, framed as idle curiosity, but it was enough. The attaché, thinking himself in a safe and pleasant corner of the evening, revealed a detail that would prove useful in the weeks ahead. And so the pavilion worked. Night after night, a place of velvet drapes and polished wood, where admiration for the Queen was rewarded with her attention, and her attention could, without appearing to, shape the currents that moved beyond its walls. But there were limits to any such arrangement. For every admirer whose loyalty could be kept, there was one who might misread the Queen's interest, or who might leave Berlin carrying not goodwill, but resentment. Louise was beginning to sense that the pavilion, for all its warmth, might also be a fragile structure, vulnerable to the cold winds of politics and the colder winds of personal vanity. The question, as she saw it, was how long she could keep the game going before some shift in the court, or in Europe itself, would change the rules entirely. By the summer of 1805, the Velvet Pavilion had begun to take on a different air. The conversations were still light, the wine still poured in measured crystal goblets, but the mood beneath the surface had shifted. Europe was tilting more sharply toward crisis, and Napoleon's shadow loomed over every quiet exchange. Louise, could feel it in the way her guests spoke, the little hesitations before mentioning French troop movements, the quick glances exchanged between military men who once would have debated openly. Her admirers were still many, though some had been replaced by others as diplomatic appointments changed and political tides shifted. The Swedish attaché had been reassigned. The tulip officer was now stationed in the Rhineland. Their absences were filled by new faces, a serious-minded Austrian envoy with an unfortunate fondness for lecturing, a young Russian nobleman whose courtly manners seemed borrowed from another century. They were loyal in their way, but their energy was different. Louise sensed they had not yet learned the particular rhythm of the pavilion. The Queen herself had grown more cautious. She still asked questions, but she no longer allowed the flow of conversation to wander as freely. The stakes were too high, and Prussia's position too delicate. There were moments, sitting by the fire and listening to the Austrians speak of necessary sacrifices, when she felt the weight of the world pressing closer to her door. The pavilion had always been a place for the slow gathering of information, but now she realized she might soon need to use that information decisively. The final season of the pavilion's golden years came in early autumn. The evenings were cooler, and the velvet drapes held in a comforting warmth. The garden outside was fading into browns and golds, though the roses still gave off a last stubborn scent. Inside, Louise hosted a gathering of unusual variety. The Austrian, the Russian, a Prussian general recently returned from Paris, and, unexpectedly, an English traveller whose itinerary seemed to have brought him to Berlin at exactly the wrong, or perhaps the right time. It was during this gathering that the undercurrents became impossible to ignore. The Russian spoke more openly than he perhaps intended about his court's distrust of Napoleon's promises. The Austrian, normally careful, hinted that Vienna was already preparing for war. The Prussian general kept silent through much of it, but Louise noted the way he studied each man's face, committing their words to memory. Even the Englishman, professing himself merely a tourist, could not quite hide his interest in Prussian military preparedness. Louise played her part, with practiced grace, steering the talk toward harmless topics when the air grew too heavy. She inquired after the Russian's family estates, admired the Austrian's description of his homeland's harvest, asked the Englishman whether London's theatres were still as fine as in her youth. But she stored away the sharper remarks, knowing they might soon be more valuable than any bouquet or flattering letter she had ever received. When the guests left that night, the Queen lingered in the pavilion alone. The fire was low, the wine glasses cleared away, but the air still held the mingled scents of tobacco and perfume. She walked slowly to the window, looking out into the dark garden. It occurred to her, for the first time in years, that the pavilion was no longer a refuge. It was, instead, a vantage point, one from which she could see the storm approaching, but not stop it. The end came sooner than she expected. In 1806, Prussia went to war with Napoleon. The velvet pavilion was shuttered, not formally, but by necessity. Its guests were scattered to battlefields and distant courts. Some of her admirers never returned. The Swedish attaché died in service. The tulip officer's regiment was routed in Saxony. Even the Austrian, so fond of his own voice, fell silent in a grave far from Vienna. Louise herself was drawn into the chaos of the war, her role shifting from quiet hostess to a public symbol of Prussian resolve. She met with allies, travelled with the king, and became the face of a nation struggling against an empire. The slow, Deliberate diplomacy of the pavilion had no place in this new world of swift campaigns and decisive defeats. And yet, in quieter moments during the war, Louise thought back to those evenings, the glow of candlelight on polished wood, the faint clink of glass, the way a well-placed question could loosen the most guarded tongue. The pavilion had been, in its own way, a small masterpiece of influence. It had not stopped the war, but it had prepared her for the subtler battles of words and alliances that came after. The Velvet Pavilion was never reopened in its old form. Its furniture was repurposed. For other rooms, its drapes replaced, its purpose forgotten by most. But for those who had been there, for the handful who had understood what the Queen was doing, it remained a memory both tender and tinged with the awareness of how fragile such games are in the face of history's larger forces. And perhaps that was the lesson. Influence, like admiration, is fleeting. It must be used in its moment, for the moment will not last.